She walked into that ballroom with a ring on her finger and a future she hadn't chosen. She walked out with nothing. No fiancé, no friend, no reputation. Just the cold marble floor beneath her heels and 200 pairs of eyes watching her fall. They thought that was the end of Lydia Hale. They were wrong. This is the story of a woman who lost everything in one night and used the wreckage to build something they never saw coming. Stay until the end, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. The Whitmore estate had a way of making people feel small. It wasn't the chandeliers, though they were massive, layered crystal that caught the candlelight and threw it across the ceiling in patterns that looked almost alive. It wasn't the marble floors either, white and cold and so perfectly polished you could see your reflection in them if you looked down, which most guests were too proud to do. It was something else. Something in the architecture itself, the way the ceilings soared 30 feet up and made even the most powerful men in the city look like pieces on a chessboard, small, movable, replaceable. Lydia Hale had attended this gala every autumn for 4 years. She knew where the draft came from near the East Corridor. She knew which corner of the room had the worst acoustics. She knew that the champagne on the left side of the serving table was always slightly warmer than the right, because the staff started pouring from the left and worked their way across. She knew these things the way you know a place you've studied but never truly belonged to. Tonight she was supposed to belong. Tonight was supposed to be the beginning. She stood near the second archway, the one draped in ivory silk that rustled whenever someone passed through from the garden. Her dress was pale blue. Her mother had chosen it specifically, something soft, her mother had said, something that doesn't compete. At the time, Lydia had let it go. She was good at letting things go. She had been letting things go for 24 years, the way you learn to when the alternative is a fight you're not sure you can win. The dress did not compete. Neither did her posture, which was correct without being rigid. Neither did her smile, which she'd practiced in the mirror that morning. Wide enough to look genuine, contained enough to look composed. She looked, in other words, exactly like what she was supposed to be. A woman preparing to become the wife of Edmund Harwell, heir to the Harwell shipping fortune, and in doing so, saving her family from the quiet financial ruin that had been stalking them for 3 years. The engagement wasn't romantic. It had never pretended to be. Her father had sat her down in his study, the one that still smelled like old leather and pipe tobacco, even though he hadn't smoked in a decade, and explained the situation with the same tone he used when discussing quarterly losses. There was debt, there was a timeline, there was Edmund Harwell, who was 31 and well-connected and had expressed interest, and there was Lydia, who was 24 and educated, and her father had said with the awkward gentleness of a man who rarely expressed sentiment, the most capable person I know. She hadn't cried. She'd asked 2 practical questions about the timeline and the terms, and then she'd gone upstairs and sat in the dark for an hour, not crying, just thinking. And then she'd said yes, because the math was simple, because her family needed it, because she was capable, and capable people carried things. That had been 6 months ago. Now Edmund was across the ballroom with a glass of Bordeaux in his hand, laughing at something one of his friends had said, his sandy hair slightly disheveled in that way that looked accidental, but wasn't. He was handsome in a generic sort of way. He was charming when he wanted to be. He had never been unkind to her, exactly. More like indifferent, in the specific way of someone who has already gotten what they wanted and no longer needs to work for it. She watched him for a moment. He didn't look over. "You're doing the thing," said a voice beside her. Lydia turned. Clara Fontaine materialized from the crowd the way she always did, as if she'd been there the whole time and you'd simply failed to notice. She was dark-haired and sharp-eyed and wearing a red dress that absolutely competed with everything in the room, which was entirely on purpose. Clara had been Lydia's closest friend for 11 years. They had met at 16 at an academic competition where they'd been placed on opposing teams and spent 3 hours trying to dismantle each other's arguments. Afterward, Clara had found her in the hallway and said, without preamble, "You almost had me on the 3rd round. I want to know how." 11 years. Lydia trusted her with everything. She trusted her with the truth about the engagement, that it was strategic, not romantic. She trusted her with the truth about her father's debts. She trusted her with the small private grief of a woman who was doing the right thing and felt hollow about it. "What thing?" Lydia said. "The thing where you watch Edmund like you're trying to figure out if he's a problem that can be solved." Clara handed her a fresh glass of champagne, which Lydia took automatically. "He's not. He's just a person. A fairly unremarkable one, honestly." "That's a terrible thing to say about the man I'm going to marry." "It's a terrible situation," Clara said lightly. "I'm just being accurate." She sipped her own drink. "How are you feeling?" "Actually, fine." "Lydia." "I'm fine, Clara. I'm present. I'm here. The dress fits, the shoes don't hurt yet, and Edmund hasn't said anything genuinely offensive in at least 2 weeks. That counts as progress." Clara looked at her for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. Then she laughed. Not a real laugh, which was loud and slightly undignified and one of Lydia's favorite sounds, but a shorter, softer version. "You're impossible," she said. I'm practical." "Those aren't different things." Clara touched her arm briefly. "I have to go say hello to the Ashworth women before they decide I've snubbed them. Come find me in an hour?" "Of course." Clara slipped back into the crowd. Lydia watched her go, the red dress cutting through ivory and black and gold like a flame moving through still air. She turned back to the room. Edmund had moved. She tracked him automatically, the way you track something you've been told to care about even when the feeling hasn't arrived yet. Toward the eastern corridor, the one with the draft, where the noise from the ballroom dimmed to a low murmur. She wasn't following him. She just needed air. The corridor was cooler and quieter. A few guests clustered near the far end, near the doors to the garden. A couple stood in a private alcove, not speaking, simply close. Lydia kept her pace even, unhurried, her champagne glass still in hand. She heard them before she saw them. Not words, at first, just the quality of silence that forms when two people think they are alone. A different kind of quiet than empty space. The alcove halfway down the corridor behind the curtain of flowering vines that the estate's decorator had placed along the wall for tonight's event. She wasn't trying to listen. She stopped because she heard her own name. "Don't know why she thinks this is permanent." Edmund's voice, low, slightly impatient. "The arrangement was always temporary. Once the contract is signed and her father's situation stabilizes, she'll know." A woman's voice. Not unknown, not a stranger. Clara's voice. "She won't know anything she can prove." Edmund again. "And by then it won't matter. The Hale name has enough value to serve its purpose. After the wedding, 6 months, maybe 8, the terms give me grounds to renegotiate. Her father's lawyers were sloppy. My father's weren't." Lydia stood very still. Her heart was doing something strange, not racing, not stopping, just changing, like a mechanism shifting gears. "She trusts me," Clara said. "That's useful." A pause. "I told you," Clara said, quieter now, "that this was starting to feel wrong. You told me you wanted the Fontaine shipping contract secured before year-end, and I told you I could make that happen. Nothing has changed." Edmund's tone was flat, businesslike. The same tone he probably used in board meetings. "Keep her calm until the wedding. That's all I need." "And after?" "After," Edmund said. "She can be as unhappy as she likes. With the right legal framework in place, her unhappiness becomes entirely her problem." The silence that followed was different from the first one. Lydia was aware, distantly, that she was still holding the champagne glass. She was aware that she had not moved. She was aware that the sound from the ballroom had continued unchanged. Laughter, string music, the clink of crystal. Indifferent to the small, complete destruction taking place in this corridor. She thought, 6 months. She thought, her father's lawyers were sloppy. She thought, keep her calm. The heat came after the cold. Not rage, not yet, but something more fundamental, something below rage, which is the feeling of realizing that the ground you were standing on was never ground at all. It was a painted floor over a drop, and you'd been walking on it for 6 months, and the people who painted it had been watching you walk. She took one breath, then she turned and walked back the way she'd come. The ballroom was exactly as she'd left it. Lydia moved through it with the same measured pace, the same correct posture, the same contained smile. She set her glass on a passing tray. She nodded at the Marchetti sisters, who were grouped near the piano. She exchanged 3 words with Lord Pemberton about the quality of the evening's string quartet. Inside her head, something was very, very quiet. Not empty. The opposite of empty. So full that it had gone past noise into something dense and still, like the moment before a pressure system breaks. She had 2 options. The first option was the one that made sense, or the one that would have made sense an hour ago. Return to the room, smile through the rest of the evening, go home, and deal with this privately, surgically, through the appropriate channels. Speak to her own lawyer, protect her family's position, extract herself quietly, in a way that caused minimum disruption, minimum exposure, minimum loss. The second option was the one that the cold, clear, furious part of her brain was already mapping out without her permission. She understood, in a way she hadn't 30 minutes ago, what this event actually was. It wasn't a social gathering, it was a stage. 200 people were present, and every single one of them knew who she was in relation to Edmund Harwell. They knew about the engagement. They'd seen them together. They'd watched Edmund's hand at the small of her back during the early part of the evening and registered it as a data point. Lydia Hale is his, which meant that what happened on this stage tonight would define what story was told tomorrow. The first option preserved nothing, not really. Even handled quietly, the dissolution of an engagement this public would generate narrative. People would ask questions, people would draw conclusions. And without controlling the story, those conclusions would be shaped by whoever spoke first, which, in this social world, would be Edmund. She had seen it before. She knew how it went. The woman became the problem. The woman became the cautionary tale. The woman became the subject of compassionate headshakes and loaded silences, and the particular cruelty of people who claim to feel sorry for you while making sure everyone knows exactly what happened. The second option had risks, large ones. She was alone, angry, and operating on information she'd gathered from behind a curtain in a corridor. She had no allies here. She had no plan. Not a real one. But she had the room, and she had the truth. And she was not, she decided, going to perform contentment for 1 more minute while Edmund Harwell circulated with his Bordeaux and his plans, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had never once looked at her and seen a person capable of causing him any trouble. She straightened, set her shoulders, smoothed the front of the pale blue dress that her mother had chosen because it didn't compete, and she walked toward the center of the room. She didn't make a scene immediately. That wasn't the move. Making a scene without preparation was just chaos, and chaos didn't favor the person with less social capital, which, in this room, was her. She needed positioning. She needed to be visible. She needed people to have noticed her before anything happened, so that when it did, they would be watching already. She moved through the room with intention, stopping at clusters of people she knew well enough to exchange a genuine word with. Lady Hargrove, who was 70 and had outlasted 4 social scandals of her own and regarded everything with the serene amusement of someone who has learned that nearly nothing is permanent. The young architect, whose name she couldn't remember, but who had once told her something interesting about the physics of load-bearing arches. 2 women from the city council, both sharp, both well-connected. She was planting herself in memory. She was being seen, not as Edmund's fiancé, not as the pale blue complement to his social presence, but as a separate person with her own presence, her own voice, her own weight in a room. It took 20 minutes. She was talking with the council women about a proposed development project near the Old Wharf district when she felt him before she saw him. A shift in the room's atmosphere. Subtle. The kind of thing you only notice if you've learned to read crowds, and Lydia, who had spent her entire life navigating social environments while pretending she wasn't, had learned. A slight drawing in, a collective micro-adjustment in posture, the way people orient toward a gravitational center without consciously deciding to. She turned. He was standing near the main entrance. She had heard the name Adrian Voss before, the way you hear thunder before rain, as a warning, abstract and distant. He was 34, she knew. He had inherited the Voss estate and title at 22, and had, in the years since, expanded the family's already considerable influence into 3 additional industries in a way that struck most of his contemporaries as either brilliant or unsettling, depending on how much they were threatened by it. He attended almost no social events. When he did attend, people noticed. He was tall, not in the exaggerated way of men who make a point of their height, but genuinely, with the build of someone who had been put together without waste. Dark hair, dark jacket, a stillness about him that was different from composure. Composure was something you performed. What he had was something you either possessed or you didn't. His eyes moved across the room with the calibrated efficiency of someone who had already decided most of what he was looking at wasn't particularly interesting. And then they stopped. On her. Lydia held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register that she had, short enough to not turn it into something. Then she looked away. Her heart was doing the gear-shifting thing again. She didn't know why he was here. She didn't know why he had looked at her. She filed both observations away and returned her attention to the councilwomen, though she was aware, with a clarity that had nothing to do with good sense, that Adrian Voss had not yet looked away. Edmund found her in the edge of the room 15 minutes later. She had been expecting this. He circulated the room on a loose schedule. She'd learned it without trying to, the way you learn the rhythm of something you've been living adjacent to for months. He would come to check on her. Not because he cared how she was doing, she understood now, but because her position in the room was part of the performance he was maintaining. He appeared at her elbow with his Bordeaux and his easy smile. "You look like you're planning something," he said, which he probably thought was charming. "I look exactly the same as I always do," Lydia said. "Fair point." He touched her arm, lightly, the way you touch something you own. "Are you enjoying yourself?" "It's a lovely event." "It is." He scanned the room over her shoulder, assessing. "I spoke with your father briefly earlier. He seemed in good spirits." "He usually is at social events." "Right." Edmund glanced at her. Something in his expression shifted slightly. The smallest recalibration, like a man who has just noticed a piece on the board has moved and isn't certain when it happened. "You're quiet tonight." "I'm often quiet." "Different quiet." He studied her. "Everything all right?" Lydia looked at him, looked at his face, the handsome, uncomplicated surface of it, the easy confidence of a man who had never had serious reason to question his own position. She thought about the corridor. She thought about keep her calm, and her father's lawyers were sloppy, and her unhappiness becomes entirely her problem. She smiled. "Everything is fine, Edmund," she said. "Enjoy your evening." He held her gaze for a beat, then nodded and moved on. She watched him go. Her hands were entirely steady. It was Clara who sought her out next. She came from the direction of the garden doors, which meant she'd gone outside at some point, to collect herself maybe, or to have a private conversation. Her red dress looked slightly different now, the way a person's clothes do after a private moment. Less deliberate. More worn. "Lydia," she said. Her voice was almost entirely normal. Almost. "I've been looking for you." "Have you?" Claire's eyes did a quick inventory of her face. Sharp eyes, always. That was part of what Lydia had loved about her. Clara noticed things. Clara saw things other people missed. It had seemed for 11 years like a feature. "Are you?" Clara stopped. Started again. "Did something happen?" "Why would something have happened?" "You just seem..." She searched for the word. "Somewhere else." Lydia turned to face her fully. She let herself really look at Clara. The familiar face. The eyes that were doing that thing they sometimes did when Clara was calculating, measuring, deciding on an approach. She had always thought that was a sign of intelligence. She understood now that it was also a sign of something else. "I heard you," Lydia said, very quietly. Just the two of them, in the low noise of the room. Clara went still. "In the corridor," Lydia continued in the same quiet voice, "behind the flowering vines, you and Edmund, about contracts and timelines and keeping me calm." She watched Claire's face cycle through 4 expressions in the span of 2 seconds. Surprise, denial, calculation, and something that might have been shame, although it was hard to tell and she wasn't sure it mattered. "I heard everything." Clara opened her mouth. "Don't," Lydia said. Not harshly, just firmly. "Don't explain it. Don't tell me it was complicated or that you were in a difficult position or that he pressured you. I've heard you argue your way out of situations since we were 16. I don't want to hear it tonight. Clara closed her mouth. Her jaw was tight. How long? Lydia asked. A long pause. 4 months? The shipping contract. It was... Yes. And was any of it real? These past 4 months, our conversations. When I told you... She stopped. There were specific things she had told Clara during the past 4 months. Specific fears, specific small griefs about the engagement, specific moments of doubt that she had shared in the way you share things with someone you trust absolutely. Those things were now... What? Data? Useful information passed along to the man who was planning to exploit the legal terms of her marriage? Lydia. Clara's voice was rougher now, not composed. I know what this looks like. I know what it looks like too, Lydia said. That's why we're done. Clara flinched. Lydia turned away. She was halfway across the room when she almost walked directly into Adrian Voss. She stopped. He stopped. They were close enough that she could see the detail of the fabric of his jacket, which was expensive in a quiet way. Not performing wealth, simply embodying it. Up close, his face was harder to read than from a distance. Not closed exactly. More like it had been arranged by long habit into something that didn't give information away cheaply. You're Lydia Hale, he said. Yes. I've heard your name recently. His voice was low, even. No particular inflection. Not in connection with Harwell. In connection with a land development proposal near the Southern Harbor District. You presented a counter-analysis to the City Council 6 weeks ago. She blinked. Of all the things she had expected to come out of Adrian Voss's mouth in this moment, that was approximately last on the list. You know about that. I have an interest in that district, he said. Your counter-analysis was thorough. It identified 3 points in the original proposal that the council had missed. A pause. It was better than the original proposal. It was, she agreed, because it was, and there was no point in false modesty. They didn't use it. They didn't, but I read it. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly, but the acknowledgement of quality, which was perhaps rarer and more valuable. You're about to do something, he said then. She looked at him. I don't know what it is, he continued, but the way you've been moving through this room for the past half hour suggests a specific intention. And the conversation you just had with Clara Fontaine ended in a way that looked like it had consequences. He paused. Am I wrong? No, she said. Are you about to put yourself in a dangerous position? She considered this. Probably. Adrian Voss looked at her for a moment, a real look, the kind that takes actual inventory. Harwell, he said. Not a question. Yes. I see. He was quiet for a beat. I dislike Harwell, he said then, with a conversational simplicity that was almost funny. He's been working to undermine a contract I'm developing with the Northern Trading Consortium for 8 months, quietly, through proxies. He thinks I don't know. Lydia stared at him. He's done what? He works through proxies, Adrian repeated. It's his preferred method, apparently. He doesn't seem to understand that proxies have financial interests of their own, and financial interests are always traceable. He looked across the room to where Edmund was now speaking with a cluster of men near the fireplace. He's been assuming I'm not paying attention. I've let him think that. A silence fell between them. Not uncomfortable. Loaded, but not uncomfortable. What are you suggesting? Lydia asked. I'm not suggesting anything, Adrian said. I'm telling you that you're not the only person in this room who has reason to find Edmund Harwell's position tonight significantly less comfortable than he expects it to be. He looked back at her. What were you planning to do? I don't have a plan, she said honestly. I have a fact and a room full of witnesses. I was going to use the room. Something shifted in his expression. Approval, maybe. The specific kind that comes from recognizing a decision made under pressure. That's a reasonable start, he said. It might be more effective with a second person. Lydia looked at him, looked at the room, looked at Edmund near the fireplace, comfortable, unsuspecting, performing the role of a man whose evening was going exactly according to plan. You want to walk back in with me, she said. I want to walk back in as something, he said, not just beside you, as something specific, something the room will read clearly. His eyes were steady. The question is whether you're willing to accept that kind of visible alliance, given that you don't know me. I know your counter-analysis read better than the original proposal, she said dryly, throwing his words back. For the first time, something crossed his face that might have been the cousin of a smile. Then, Adrian Voss said, offering her his arm with the ease of a man who is entirely unafraid of the consequences of his own choices. Shall we give this room something to talk about? Lydia looked at his arm, looked at the room, thought about pale blue dresses that didn't compete, about 6 months of performing contentment, about keep her calm and her unhappiness becomes entirely her problem, and the cold, complete certainty that the life mapped out for her was built on a foundation of other people's contempt for her capacity to notice. She was 24 years old, she had a fact and a room full of witnesses, and she had just been offered a different kind of move entirely. She took his arm. Let, she said. Dumped. They walked in from the eastern corridor, the one with the draft, the one she knew by heart, and they walked slowly. There was no announcement. There was no dramatic entrance. There was simply the sight of Adrian Voss, who never attended social events and never aligned himself publicly with anyone, walking beside Lydia Hale through the center of the Whitmore Ballroom with the combined gravity of two people who were not performing casualness, but had simply decided together to be visible. The room noticed. It noticed the way a room notices things it wasn't prepared for. A collective microshift, a redistribution of attention, the slight alteration in the sound level as conversations paused, resumed, shifted in subject. Heads turned, eyes tracked. Data points were collected and transmitted across the room in real time. The invisible communication network of a social world that ran entirely on information and implication. Lydia felt it. She had spent her whole life watching rooms. She knew how to read them, and she read this one. They were a story, she and Adrian, and the room was already deciding what story it was. She didn't look at Edmund, not yet. But across the room, she felt the moment he saw them. Felt it in the slight pause in the sound from his direction, the recalibration, the first appearance of something she had never once seen on Edmund Harwell's face before. Uncertainty. The string quartet played on. The chandeliers threw their patterns across the ceiling. 200 people breathed and watched and waited, without entirely knowing they were waiting, for whatever came next. Lydia Hale kept her chin up and her hand steady on Adrian Voss's arm, and she did not look soft, and she did not look breakable, and she did not look like a woman in a pale blue dress that didn't compete. She looked like someone who had just decided to change the rules of the game entirely. And in that room, in that moment, with the cold marble beneath her heels and the chandelier light on her face, and 11 years of trust burned to ash behind her, she was not afraid. She was ready. The arm beneath her hand was steady. That was the first thing Lydia noticed, practically not its warmth or its solidity in the romantic sense that novelists would have described it, but its steadiness. Adrian Voss did not tense as they moved through the room. He did not adjust his pace, did not scan the crowd with any visible anxiety, did not perform the small compensatory behaviors of a person who is uncertain about what he's just agreed to. He simply walked, with the even, measured confidence of a man who had made a decision and had no particular interest in second-guessing it. She found that more steadying than she expected. They stopped near the center of the ballroom, close to the piano, where the sight lines were best and the acoustics carried conversation in 3 directions. A deliberate choice. She hadn't told him about the acoustics. He'd simply arrived at the same calculation. She was starting to understand why people found him unsettling. Lady Hargrove reached them first, because Lady Hargrove always reached things first. She was 70 years old and moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who knew the room would wait for her, which it always did. She looked at Adrian, then at Lydia, then at the precise distance, or lack of it, between them. Adrian Voss, she said, I haven't seen you at one of these in 2 years. 3, he said, and yet here you are. She shifted her gaze to Lydia, and the look she gave was sharp and knowing and entirely without judgment. Lady Hargrove had outlasted scandal 4 times over and held everyone she'd ever met in a kind of fond, unsentimental assessment. Lydia, you look different than you did an hour ago. The champagne improved, Lydia said. The old woman's mouth curved. Indeed. She glanced across the room. They all knew where her gaze was going, and then back. Interesting evening, she said, with the particular lightness of someone who means the opposite. Then she moved on, taking whatever she thought with her. Within 4 minutes, 6 more people had found reasons to pass within speaking distance. Not all of them stopped. Most of them didn't need to. Proximity was enough. The information was spreading the way information spread in rooms like this, not through announcements, but through observation, through the recalibration of assumptions, through the quiet, efficient machinery of collective attention. Lydia was aware of Edmund across the room. She didn't look. Not yet. She was also aware that Adrian was watching the crowd with a kind of peripheral precision, not staring at anything, but collecting everything, and that this was the behavior of someone who had spent a long time learning how rooms work, which meant he was, in this particular skill set, her equal or close to it. He's seen us, Adrian said quietly, not looking at her. I know. He's talking to Wentworth. Wentworth is one of his proxies, handles the paper trail on the consortium interference. If he's consulting him now, he's either reassessing or he's about to try to control the narrative directly. Lydia processed this. How quickly? 5 minutes? Maybe less. He reached for 2 glasses of champagne from a passing tray and handed one to her with the ease of long habit. What do you want to happen tonight? I want the engagement ended, she said. Publicly. On my terms, not his. That's achievable. I want it ended in a way that makes it impossible for him to reframe it afterward, in a way that leaves the questions pointing at him, not at me. That's harder. I know. But also achievable, he said, if you're willing to say the truth in front of people who will repeat it. He glanced at her sideways. Are you? She thought about her father, about the debt, about the fact that this engagement had been the solution to a problem that still existed, regardless of what she did tonight. Ending it publicly, before the contract was signed, meant she didn't fully know what it meant yet. It meant her family's situation was back to unsolved. It meant she had traded one kind of precariousness for another. She had stood in that corridor and heard Edmund describe her future with the brisk indifference of someone discussing a financial instrument. She had heard Clara confirm 4 months of calculated performance disguised as friendship. She had felt the specific cold of understanding that the ground you were standing on was false. Yes, she said. I'm willing. Then don't look toward him until he comes to you. Let him make the first approach. It matters which one of you initiates. Why? Because whoever approaches the other one first is perceived as needing something from the conversation. Right now, you don't need anything from him. Let the room see that. She turned to look at him directly. You're very good at this. I've had reasons to be, he said. He didn't elaborate. She didn't ask. The string quartet shifted into something slower, more atmospheric, and the conversations around them adjusted accordingly, voices dropping, the room pulling inward slightly, the way rooms do when the music changes to something that requires less effort to be heard over. The effect was to make everything feel slightly more intimate, slightly more exposed. Edmund began moving toward them. She felt it before she saw it. That same atmospheric shift from the entrance, but different in quality. Less gravitational pull, more pressure front. He was crossing the room with his Bordeaux, and he was doing it with the careful pacing of someone who wants to look casual and doesn't quite manage it. She kept her eyes on the string quartet. Lydia. His voice arrived just behind her left shoulder, close, slightly too close for the amount of ease he was performing. I was just looking for you. Were you? She said. She turned slowly. He was there, Bordeaux in hand, sandy hair, easy smile, and beside him, though slightly behind, Wentworth. A heavy-set man with the colorless, attentive expression of someone whose job is to observe and report. She clocked him, filed him, returned her attention to Edmund. Edmund's eyes had moved to Adrian. There was a beat, just one, where the mask did something, not slipping exactly. More like it registered a variable it hadn't accounted for. He had clearly seen them together from across the room, but seeing them up close, with Adrian standing next to her with the easy ownership of a man who has decided he belongs exactly where he is, produced a different calculation. "Voss," Edmund said. His tone was neutral, practiced. "I didn't realize you'd be here tonight." "I often go places without announcing myself," Adrian said. Edmund's jaw moved slightly. Then he smiled, broader, more effortful. "Well, always good to see you." He turned back to Lydia, and she could see him reassembling. "I was thinking we might do a turn around the room together. The Ashworth family is here. I promised your father I'd introduce you properly." "The Ashworths and I have met," Lydia said. "Still, it would look—" "Edmund." She kept her voice even and quiet, the same voice she'd used in the corridor when she'd told Clara don't. "I heard you earlier, in the eastern corridor." The Bordeaux glass stopped moving. In her peripheral vision, Wentworth had gone very still. "I don't know what you think you—" Edmund began. "The contract terms," she said. "The proxies. What you described as the right legal framework." She watched his face do its inventory, watched him measure how much she could have heard and from where. "I heard everything," she said. "Enough of everything." He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, "You're misunderstanding a business conversation." "I'm really not." "Lydia." His voice took on a texture, the patronizing patience of a man who has decided the best strategy is to make the woman feel confused about her own perception. She had heard that voice before from other men in other rooms. She had once or twice let it work. "You were upset about something tonight. You went to a quiet corridor to collect yourself. You heard fragments of a conversation that Clara was with you," she said. That one landed. She saw it. A fractional tightening around his eyes. "She told me the timeline," Lydia continued. 4 months. The shipping contract. The Fontaine agreement. She was keeping her voice low because this was still, for now, a private conversation, and she was still deciding when to change that. "I know the structure of what you built." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he glanced at Adrian, then back at her, and something changed in his expression. Not remorse, nothing that honest, but a recalculation. The expression of a man who has just decided that the situation he's in requires a different kind of management and who is comfortable making that shift. "You've had a difficult evening," he said, and his voice was different now, gentler, with a precision to the gentleness. "You're clearly distressed. I think perhaps you should—" "Don't," Adrian said. Not loudly, almost conversationally, but Edmund stopped. "Don't do the thing where you suggest she's not perceiving accurately," Adrian said. "It doesn't work on people who are actually perceiving accurately, and it makes you look like what you are." He looked at Edmund with the flat, clear attention of someone who has spent 8 months tracking proxies and paper trails and is entirely undramatic about what they've found at the end. "Which is a man who's been caught." The word sat in the air between them. Wentworth had taken a small step backward, not far enough to be conspicuous, but enough. Lydia noticed. Edmund's jaw tightened. "I don't know what she's told you." "She's told me nothing," Adrian said. "I know about the consortium. I know about Hartley and the Millbridge Proxy Company. I know the paper trail you thought was buried." A pause. "It's not buried." Edmund's face had gone the particular color of a man who has just understood that the version of this situation he was navigating is considerably more complicated than he thought. "You're bluffing." "I don't bluff," Adrian said simply. "It's an inefficient use of energy when the truth is already in your possession." A long, brittle silence. Then Edmund turned back to Lydia, and his voice came out different again, lower, and with something in it that was closer to honest than anything she'd heard from him in 6 months. Not honesty born of feeling, honesty born of pragmatic necessity. "If you do this here, tonight, you'll hurt yourself more than you hurt me. Your father's situation—" "I know my father's situation," she said. "Then you know that without this engagement—" "I know," she said again. Quieter. This was the thing she had to sit with, the part that wasn't clean, the part that didn't resolve itself with a good decision in a ballroom. Her father's debts didn't disappear because Edmund Harwell was a fraud. Her family's position didn't stabilize because she had chosen to stop performing. She knew this. She had known it, factored it, held it when she took Adrian's arm 20 minutes ago. She was making a choice that had costs. Real costs. She wasn't pretending otherwise. "My father," she said, "will deal with the situation the same way he dealt with it before you arrived in it. The same way I will." She looked at Edmund steadily. "What I won't deal with is 6 more months of being managed like a piece in a contract while you build a legal cage around the marriage before I ever walk into it." Edmund's expression had cycled back to controlled. He was good at controlled. She gave him that. "You're making a mistake," he said. Quiet. Final. The tone of a man who has decided the next move will be on his terms. "I've made them before," she said. "I recover." He looked at her for one more moment. Looked at her, she thought, possibly for the first time in 6 months with any real attention, as if only now registering that the woman he'd been maneuvering around was actually someone with functional perception and a spine. And then he turned and walked away. Wentworth followed, one step behind, already pulling out a small notebook. Lydia released a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding. The string quartet was still playing. "That was the private version," Adrian said after a moment. "Yes. The private version doesn't hold. He'll spend the next 30 minutes constructing a counter-narrative and deploying it through 3 or 4 well-positioned social connections. And by the time this evening ends, the story circulating will be whatever version serves him." She already knew this. She had known it since the corridor. "So the public version still has to happen." "Yes. Tonight." "Tonight," he confirmed. "If you want control of the story, you have maybe—" He glanced at the room, reading the temperature. "An hour before his version starts to take root." Lydia looked at the room that she had been navigating carefully for 20 minutes, planting herself in memory, being seen as a separate person. The room that had watched her walk in with Adrian Voss and had spent the subsequent half hour quietly reconfiguring its understanding of what this evening was. "There's something else," she said. "Tell me." He said there are other families in situations like mine. Other arrangements he's leveraging. She paused. "Clara mentioned names once, in passing. I didn't think anything of it at the time." She looked at Adrian. "If he's done this systematically—" "He has," Adrian said flatly. "I know of 2 other cases, possibly more." "Then this isn't just about tonight," she said. "It can't be." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It can't be." She turned to face the room fully. This was the thing about surviving something. It rarely meant just getting yourself out. It meant turning around once you were clear and looking at who else was still inside. "Tell me what you know," she said, "about the other families." He told her in pieces over the next 20 minutes as they moved through the room, not standing still because standing still was a target, but moving, pausing. The conversation threaded through other conversations like a secondary current beneath the social surface. The picture that emerged was not surprising exactly, but it was larger than she'd understood from the corridor. Edmund Harwell worked through information and legal architecture rather than direct force. A cleaner method, harder to trace, and devastatingly effective in a social world where reputation was currency and contractual terms were the infrastructure beneath that currency. He identified families in financial distress, established advantageous alliance terms, and embedded contractual provisions that shifted significant power to himself once the alliance was secured. By the time the other party understood what they'd agreed to, the leverage was already in place. 3 families that Adrian could confirm. The Rains, whose eldest daughter had been engaged to Harwell's business associate under arrangements structured by Harwell himself. The Alderton family, whose son had signed a commercial agreement with a Harwell subsidiary 18 months ago, the terms of which had since trapped the family in a debt repayment structure they couldn't exit without losing their primary properties. And one other, the Marchetti family, whom Lydia knew socially, whose second daughter she had spoken to not 40 minutes ago at the piano. "Sophie Marchetti," Lydia said. "Her family is currently in negotiation with a holding company that I believe is a Harwell proxy. I haven't been able to confirm the connection yet, but the pattern matches." Lydia looked across the room to where Sophie Marchetti stood with 2 other young women near the garden doors. 21 years old, dark-eyed, laughing at something with the bright, slightly effortful laughter of someone who has been taught to perform ease in social settings. Lydia recognized it because she had worn the same expression for 6 months. She doesn't know, Lydia said. Probably not. And her family, if the negotiation closes, they'll be in the same structure the Aldertons are in, Adrian said. Possibly worse, depending on the terms. Lydia was quiet for a moment. This was the part that the corridor hadn't prepared her for. Her own situation she could calculate. The costs, the risks, the decision tree going forward. But Sophie Marchetti was 21 years old and laughing by the garden doors. And in a few weeks, or months, or whenever the negotiation closed, she would sit down with her family and discover that they had agreed to terms that would trap them. And the person responsible for constructing those terms would still be in this room tonight, in his well-cut jacket, with his Bordeaux, rebuilding his narrative and preparing his next move. "What do you need to expose the connection?" she said. Adrian glanced at her. There was something in the look, not surprise, but attention, the specific kind of attention you give someone when they've just confirmed a hypothesis. 2 documents. One is in Harwell's company records. I have a source who can access it, but it takes time. The other is a financial transfer record from the Millbridge Proxy Company, which is publicly filed but requires correlating 3 separate filings to identify the connection clearly. How long? To do it properly? 2 weeks? To do it fast and rough, in a way that's usable but not airtight? 48 hours. Can you do 48 hours? If I pull 2 people off other work, yes. Then do it. She looked at him. I'll come to you with whatever Clara might have. She kept records. She kept records of everything. It was compulsive with her. She used to say documentation was just good practice. Her voice stayed steady on Clara's name, which took effort, but not as much as she expected. She won't give them to me willingly, but I know where she keeps them. How do you know that? Because I helped her set up her filing system 3 years ago, Lydia said. When she said documentation was good practice, she wasn't wrong. Adrian was quiet for a beat. You're thinking several steps ahead for someone who found out about this tonight. I've been thinking several steps ahead since I was 12, she said. Nobody usually notices because I've spent most of my adult life being told that noticing things is a personality flaw in women. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her, the specific accumulated bitterness of years of being perceptive in environments that punished perception. She clipped it back. That's not useful right now. It's accurate, he said, without particular judgment. But you're right. Not useful right now. She almost laughed. Didn't. We still need the public version, she said. Tonight. Yes. I want to talk to Sophie Marchetti first. He nodded, once, the nod of someone who has decided she's navigating correctly and doesn't need to supervise her choices. Sophie Marchetti, up close, was sharper than she appeared from across a room. She had the kind of social surface that was easy to misread, pleasant, accommodating, slightly deferential in the way of someone who has been taught that these qualities are assets. But her eyes moved constantly in the micro way that Lydia recognized, tracking the room, reading people, storing information. She was, Lydia thought, very good at not being underestimated by appearing underestimatable. They were 2 of a kind, possibly. That thought was both comforting and awful. Lydia Hale, Sophie said when Lydia appeared beside her. Her 2 companions drifted away with the natural grace of people who recognize a private conversation forming. I've been watching you move through this room for the past hour and wondering what you were doing. Did you come to any conclusions? Several. None that explained the man on your arm. That's complicated, Lydia said. Most interesting things are. Sophie's gaze was direct. What are you here for? Actually, Lydia considered how to approach this. She could be indirect, she could take her time, she could frame it carefully, or she could say what she knew Sophie Marchetti, with her tracking eyes and her too bright laugh, probably already had some awareness of somewhere below the social performance. Your family is in negotiation with a company called Meridian Holdings, she said. Sophie's expression didn't change. Not a visible flinch, but her breathing shifted slightly. How do you know that? Because Meridian Holdings is not what it represents itself to be, Lydia said. and neither is the person behind it. Silence. The garden doors near them were open, and the cooler air came through. And somewhere behind them, the string quartet was playing something that belonged to a different conversation entirely. "Are you saying," Sophie said very carefully, "that my family's negotiation is—" "I'm saying," Lydia said, "that before that negotiation closes, someone who understands the legal architecture of what's being proposed should look at the terms very carefully. Someone who isn't dependent on the deal being good." Sophie looked at her. Looked at her the way you look at someone who has just handed you something dangerous and called it information. "And who would that someone be?" "I can give you a name," Lydia said. "Someone I trust, who's already pulled the documents." She paused. "I need something from you in return." "What?" "Whatever you know about the Harwell connection to Meridian, anything you've noticed, anything that felt odd." She watched Sophie's face do its calculation. The quick, efficient processing of risk versus benefit, exposure versus protection. "I'm not asking you to do anything public. Not yet. I'm asking you to tell me what you've already seen." Sophie looked away. Across the room to where Edmund Harwell was now in conversation with a different cluster of men, 3 of them, all of them attentive. Rebuilding. Repositioning. "He came to dinner," Sophie said finally. Quiet. "Twice this spring. He was very charming. He said he knew people who could help with the family's—" She stopped. "Situation." "Yes." "And the referral to Meridian came through him." "Yes." "I thought it was—" Sophie's jaw tightened. "I thought he was being kind." "He's very good at looking kind," Lydia said. "That's the specific skill he has." Sophie turned back to her. Her eyes were doing something now that wasn't tracking, something rawer. "How bad is it? What Meridian is offering?" "I don't know the specific terms of your family's negotiation, but if the pattern holds—" Lydia chose her words. "It's designed to look like relief and function like a trap. The terms that look generous on the surface embed provisions that transfer significant power to the other party once you're dependent on the arrangement." Sophie absorbed this. Her hands, Lydia noticed, had gone very still. "My father signed a letter of intent last week." "A letter of intent isn't a contract," Lydia said. "There's still time." "How much time?" "I don't know, but whatever time there is," she looked at Sophie directly. "Use it." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's your name going to look like tomorrow, after whatever happens tonight?" "I don't know yet," Lydia said honestly. "Probably not good, for a while." "And you're still doing it." "My family needed that engagement," Lydia said. "It was supposed to be the thing that fixed everything. I chose it for them, or I let myself be chosen for it, which isn't quite the same, but feels that way." She paused. "And it turned out the fix was also a trap. So I'm in exactly the same position I was in before it, except now I know what kind of person I'm dealing with, and I know he's dealing with others the same way." She looked at Sophie. "I can be uncomfortable tomorrow, or I can be complicit tonight. Those are the 2 options I have." Sophie looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into the small clutch bag she carried and removed a folded piece of paper. "I make notes," she said. "At dinners. It's a habit. I write down things that feel significant without knowing why." She held the paper out. "He said something at the second dinner. About timing. Something about how the filing structure meant the first review period wouldn't trigger until after a certain date. I wrote it down because it seemed odd. I don't know if it's useful." Lydia took the paper, unfolded it, read the 6 lines of Sophie's neat, compressed handwriting, felt something clarify in her chest. A small, sharp thing, like a key turning. "It's useful," she said. Sophie nodded. "Once." "Tell me the name." "The person who can look at the terms." Lydia told her. She tucked the paper into her own small bag, closed the clasp, and turned back toward the room. Adrian was waiting 30 feet away, positioned with a glass of water now instead of champagne, talking to no one, watching everything. He met her eyes across the room, and his expression asked the question without him needing to say it. She gave the smallest nod. He set down his glass. The room was at its densest now. past the early fluidity of an evening where people were still finding their footing, into the later, richer stage where the social configurations had settled and the conversations had gone deeper and the ambient alcohol had loosened everyone's careful edges just enough. This was the moment when the room had its full attention available and its defenses were slightly lower, and the things that happened would be remembered with the vivid specificity that characterized memories formed in states of heightened feeling. They moved to the center of the ballroom floor. Not toward Edmund directly, not yet. Just to the center, where the acoustic geometry of the space meant that a voice pitched at the right level would carry further than it should, and where the visual exposure was maximum. Lydia stopped walking, turned, faced the room. Beside her, Adrian Voss stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and his full, unhurried attention on her, not performing support, actually giving it. There was a difference, and she knew the difference now. "Adrian," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "Yes. If this goes badly, define badly. If it doesn't work, if the room sides with him, if my father's position becomes untenable in the family situation, then we deal with that," he said, separately, specifically, with actual information rather than worst-case projection. He looked at her. "You're about to do something difficult. Don't add hypothetical catastrophes to it. One thing at a time." She almost told him that one thing at a time was not how her brain worked, that her brain was constitutionally incapable of not running contingency calculations, and that the 6 worst-case scenarios currently running in her head were extremely detailed and highly specific. She almost told him that the steadiness he was displaying was frankly slightly unreasonable, given the circumstances. She said nothing, because he wasn't wrong, and she knew it. She looked at Edmund across the room. He looked back. And then, because this was the last window, the last moment before action became permanent, she held his gaze across 20 feet of marble and candlelight and the gathered attention of 200 people who were, without yet knowing it, witnesses. The string quartet chose that exact moment, with impeccable and entirely coincidental timing, to reach the end of a piece. The music stopped, the room exhaled, Lydia opened her mouth, and Edmund Harwell spoke first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, loud enough for the nearest 40 people to hear, his voice carrying the warm, controlled authority of a man who has decided that the best defense is an offense, that he will shape this story before she can, that he will frame whatever has happened tonight as a misunderstanding to be gently and publicly managed. "I think most of you know that this evening was meant to be a celebration. I'd like to say before the night ends that sometimes—" "Edmund," her voice. Quiet, but the acoustics were exactly what she'd known they would be. Every head that hadn't already been turning, turned. Lydia Hale stood in the center of the ballroom floor, in the pale blue dress that didn't compete, and looked at her fiancé across the silence. "You were saying?" she said. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Lydia counted them. 1. Edmund's prepared speech hung in the air, half-finished, its intended shape visible to anyone paying attention. He had been going to be gracious. He had been going to frame whatever was happening as a mutual misunderstanding, something to be resolved privately, between adults, with the genteel sadness of people who had simply discovered they were not right for each other. He had been going to own the narrative in the kindest, most devastating way available to a man of his social position, through magnanimity. 2. The room had registered her voice. She could see it moving through the crowd the way a current moves through water, people orienting without deciding to, conversations dropping mid-sentence, glasses pausing on their way to mouths. 3. Edmund looked at her, really looked. Not the assessing glance of a man managing a situation, but the direct look of someone who has just understood that the situation is no longer manageable in the way he planned. 4. Wentworth, standing 6 feet behind Edmund's left shoulder, pulled out his notebook. Then the silence ended because Lydia spoke into it. "I owe everyone here an explanation," she said. Her voice carried. She'd known it would. She had chosen this exact spot for this exact reason, and the acoustic geometry of the Whitmore Ballroom was as familiar to her as her own living room. "Not for my behavior tonight, for my silence over the past 6 months." Edmund took a step forward. "Lydia, I'm speaking, she said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was the specific tone of a person who has decided that the social contract which required her to yield in moments like this no longer applies, and who is comfortable with that decision, and who is not, notably, afraid. Edmund stopped. The room had gone to the particular quality of quiet that only forms when 200 people are collectively holding their breath. The string quartet had set down their bows. Even the servers had stopped moving. 6 months ago, I agreed to an engagement that was never, on either side, romantic, Lydia continued. Most of you know this. In these circles, it would be disingenuous to pretend otherwise. Families in difficult financial positions make strategic alliances. That's not a secret, and I'm not ashamed of it. She paused, kept her voice even. What I didn't know, when I agreed, was that the arrangement had been designed with provisions specifically intended to trap my family in a dependent position once the marriage was legal. Provisions embedded in the contract terms that my family's lawyers hadn't identified. She looked at Edmund steadily. I found out tonight. The room exhaled. Not with shock. This world was not easily shocked, but with the specific alertness of a group of people whose social calculations had just been required to update significantly. Edmund's face was controlled. She gave him credit for it. He was good. He was very, very good at the performance of a reasonable man. What you're describing, he said, and his voice was measured, warm at the edges, precisely calibrated to sound like concern rather than damage control, is a misunderstanding of standard contract language. I understand you're upset. I'm not upset, Lydia said. I'm accurate. A sound moved through the room, not laughter, something adjacent, the compressed sound of a group of people recognizing a moment. The specific provision, she said, is a clause in Section 14 of the engagement contract that allows for unilateral renegotiation of the marital property terms at the 6-month mark of the marriage, triggered by a standard of living assessment conducted by a firm of the groom's selection. She watched Edmund's eyes. The firm specified in the contract is Alderton Assessment Partners, which is a subsidiary of a holding company called Meridian Holdings. She paused. Which is, in turn, controlled by a trust registered to Edmund Harwell's family office. The quality of the room changed. Lady Hargrove, 30 feet to Lydia's left, had gone very still. The two councilwomen near the fireplace were looking at each other. The Marchetti sisters, she could see them from here, had the fixed, attentive expression of people hearing something they needed to hear. That's a very serious allegation, Edmund said. His voice was still measured, still controlled, but it had lost the warmth, just slightly, just enough. And I'd be careful about making it publicly without what? Lydia said. Documentation? She reached into her small bag and removed Sophie's folded note. She didn't unfold it. She didn't need to. The act of producing it, something written, something physical, something that existed as an object in the room, was enough. The room registered it as evidence with the reflexive certainty of people who understood that documents were the architecture of their world. The Meridian connection is documented, she said. The Alderton connection is documented. The filing structure that was used to obscure the relationship between the assessment firm and the Harwell family office, that's documented as well. She kept her eyes on Edmund. What isn't fully documented yet, but will be within 48 hours, is how many other families were approached with similar arrangements. Silence. Edmund had stopped performing warm concern. His expression was flat now, the surface of it still composed, but underneath she could see it, the working machinery of a man running calculation after calculation and not liking the results. You have no idea what you're doing, he said. Quiet, direct, the first genuinely honest thing he'd said to her all evening. I'm ending the engagement, she said. Publicly, on my terms. She looked at him. That's what I'm doing. Edmund looked at her for one long moment. Then he looked at Adrian Voss, who was standing 6 feet to Lydia's right, with his hands loose at his sides, and the expression of a man who has already decided how this ends, and is simply waiting for the sequence to complete. Then back at Lydia. You'll regret this, Edmund said. Still quiet. Not a threat. Too flat for a threat. A prediction. the tone of a man who has more moves available than the ones visible on the surface. "Add it to the list," Lydia said. Edmund picked up his glass of Bordeaux from the tray of a nearby server, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the east corridor with the measured pace of a man who has decided not to run. Wentworth followed. The room erupted. Not in chaos. This crowd was too practiced for chaos. It erupted in conversation, dozens of parallel threads igniting simultaneously, the collective processing of a social system that had just received a significant input and was running it through every available channel. The noise level doubled in 30 seconds. People were moving, toward Lydia, toward each other, toward the exits where they could make private calls. Lydia stood in the center of the floor and felt the room reorient around her. It was not comfortable. She had expected some version of this, and it was still not comfortable. The weight of 200 people's attention, the awareness that every word she'd said was already being repeated, evaluated, cross-referenced against existing knowledge and social calculation. She had put herself in the exact center of a story she couldn't fully control from here. She had done it on purpose, and she was still not prepared for the specific gravity of it. Adrian appeared at her shoulder. "You did well," he said under the noise. "I don't feel like I did well." "That's because doing well and feeling like you did well are different things, and the second one takes longer." He scanned the room. "Lady Hargrove is coming. She matters. The way she receives this will influence approximately 30% of the room's final position. Be direct with her. Don't explain yourself." Lydia almost told him she didn't need coaching. Then she decided that was pride talking, and pride was expensive tonight. "Anything else?" "The councilwomen by the fireplace want to talk to you. Let them come to you. Don't go to them." He paused. "And someone has gone to get your father." Her stomach dropped. "Where is he?" "East sitting room. He was taking a break from the main floor. He does that at these events. He finds them loud." Adrian glanced at her. "He doesn't know yet." "I need to get to him before someone else does." "Yes, but Hargrove first." 30 seconds. Lady Hargrove arrived with the unhurried inevitability of a weather system. She looked at Lydia with the same expression she'd used at the beginning of the evening, sharp, knowing, absent of judgment. "Well," she said, "Lady Hargrove. That was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I've seen in this ballroom in 20 years, she said. "Possibly both. Usually both." She looked at Lydia's face with the attentiveness of someone reading small print. "How much of what you said do you actually have documentation for?" "Enough," Lydia said. "More in 48 hours." Enough is a lawyer's answer. "I'm not a lawyer." "No." Lady Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "The Alderton family has been trying to extract themselves from a Harwell contract for 8 months, she said then. Not loudly. "They haven't discussed it publicly because the terms include a non-disclosure provision. But Margaret Alderton told me in confidence 2 months ago that they felt," she chose her word carefully, "cornered." Lydia absorbed this. Would she speak to that, if asked? With the right framework in legal protection, other families involved, enough weight that she's not standing alone? The old woman considered. Possibly. Margaret is not weak, she's been isolated. She looked at Lydia with something that was close to approval. "Don't waste the opening you've just made." Then she moved away, and in her wake, the first of approximately 11 conversations arrived, all of them wanting something: information, confirmation, alliance, or simply proximity to whoever was currently at the center of the room's story. Lydia handled 6 of them before she extracted herself toward the east sitting room. Her father was sitting in an armchair near the window when she got there, his evening jacket unbuttoned, a glass of water on the side table beside him. He was 61 and looked it, not badly, but honestly, with the particular tiredness of a man who has been carrying weight for long enough that it has become visible. He looked up when she came in, and something in his expression shifted. The immediate animal recognition of a parent who can tell from 30 feet away that something is wrong. "Lydia." He started to rise. "Stay," she said. She pulled a chair close and sat across from him, their knees almost touching. "I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you before you hear it from someone else." He stayed. She told him. "Not everything. Not the granular detail of the legal provisions and the proxy companies and the 48-hour documentation timeline. Just the essential shape. What she'd heard in the corridor, what she'd understood, what she'd said in the ballroom, and what it meant for the engagement. He was quiet through all of it. Her father had never been a man who interrupted. It was one of the things she loved about him. He listened with his full attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, actually listening. His face moved through several things as she talked. Recognition, pain, the specific grief of a parent realizing their child has been carrying something alone, and something harder to read. Something that looked toward the end almost like relief. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the distant sound of the ballroom and the city traffic beyond the window. "I should have looked more carefully at the contract," he said. "Your lawyers should have." "I chose those lawyers." He looked at his hands. "I was in a hurry. I wanted it resolved. He stopped. "I wanted you to not have to worry." "Dad, I know." He looked up. "I know. That's not an excuse." It was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" It was such a simple question, such a direct human question, with no social calculation in it, no positioning, no agenda. "Are you all right?" She felt something in her chest respond to it, the way a drawn bowstring responds to release, the tension of 6 months coming through in a way she hadn't given it permission. "I'm functioning," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed, "but it's what I have right now." He nodded. Then, after a moment, "The debt situation. I know. It doesn't disappear because—" "I know, Dad, I know that." She took a breath. "There are other options. There were always other options. We went to this one too fast without enough information." She looked at him steadily. "Adrian Voss is here tonight. He's been working against Harwell already, for his own reasons. If he's willing to, I don't know yet what the shape of that looks like, but there are options." Her father studied her face. "You've known this man for, what, an hour?" "About that." "And you trust him?" She thought about the arm that didn't tense, the voice that said one thing at a time without performing patience, the man who had read her counter-analysis on the Harbor District development and considered it good work. "I don't trust him," she said. "I have evidence that his interests and mine are currently aligned and that he's effective. That's different from trust. Trust takes longer." Her father looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached out and took her hand briefly, the way he had when she was small and frightened of thunderstorms, and he wanted her to know that the sound was bigger than the danger. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need." She came back to the ballroom 20 minutes later. In those 20 minutes, the room had reorganized. The casual social configurations of an early evening had given way to something more deliberate. Clusters of people who had found each other for specific reasons, conversations that had a directional quality, the social world running its processing algorithms in real time. She could read it. She could always read it. And what she read was that the room had not yet settled. That was good. A room that hadn't settled was a room that could still be shaped. What was not good was what she saw near the main entrance. Edmund had not left. She had expected him to leave. She had, if she was honest, relied on it, on the assumption that a man whose position in a room has been publicly challenged will remove himself to regroup privately. Edmund had done something different. He had removed himself to the eastern corridor, which she had correctly predicted, and then he had returned. He was standing near the entrance now with 3 men she didn't recognize. Not his usual social circle, not the casual cluster of inherited wealth contemporaries who moved with him in these rooms. These 3 men were older, harder looking, with the specific quality of people who are not here for the social event. One of them was on a phone. The other 2 were listening to Edmund with the focused attention of professionals receiving a briefing. She stopped walking. "Adrian?" She said it quietly without turning her head. He was there in 6 seconds. She didn't ask how he managed that. She was beginning to understand that he always knew where everyone was in a room. "I see them," he said. "Who are they?" "The one on the phone is a lawyer. Marcus Thane. He specializes in injunctions and defamation actions. He's filed 16 in the past 4 years, won 14 of them." Adrian's voice was even, informational. The other two I don't recognize directly, but the one on the left was at the Alderton hearing 8 months ago. I saw him in a photograph. He's going to file something, she said, tonight if he can, or threaten to file, which has the same short-term effect. Adrian paused. An injunction against further public statements could silence me before the 48-hour documentation is complete, she said. Yes. She thought through the logic of this quickly. A defamation action, or the credible threat of one, did several things simultaneously. It reframed her as an aggressor rather than an exposer. It forced her and her family into a legal posture that required resources they didn't currently have in surplus. And it created a chilling effect on anyone else in the room who might be considering speaking up. The Aldertons, the Marchettis, anyone else in Harwell's orbit who had been listening tonight and thinking about what it meant for their own situation. It was elegant, in a brutal way. She gave him that too. How long do we have? She said. If he's having Thane draft tonight, possibly until morning. Courts don't move that fast, but the threat alone could be enough to... How much of what I said tonight can he actually make a defamation case from? Adrian was quiet for a moment. The specific allegations about the contract provisions, those were factual, and you have documentation. That's defensible. He paused. The implication about other families, the use of words like designed and trap, those are characterizations that a good lawyer can work with, she finished. Yes. She looked at Edmund across the room. He hadn't looked back. He was still briefing the three men, his voice low and controlled, his expression back to its baseline composure. Working. He was always working. There's another move, she said. Tell me. The Alderton family. Lady Hargrove said they have a non-disclosure provision in their contract. If that provision was obtained under duress, or if its terms are themselves illegal, breaking an NDA by going public exposes them to significant liability. Unless someone else goes public first, she said. Unless the core information is already in the public record before the NDA can be invoked. She stopped, worked through it. If I go back out there tonight and say specifically what I know about the Alderton situation, not in detail, not enough to constitute the protected information under the NDA, but enough to establish the pattern, then the NDA becomes significantly harder to enforce because the information it was designed to protect is already... That's a very thin legal line to walk in real time in a ballroom without a lawyer present, Adrian said. I know. If you get it wrong, I know. She turned to look at him directly. Is the line walkable? He thought about it. She watched him think. The actual work of it, not performance, the specific quality of attention that comes from someone running real analysis rather than reassuring you. Yes, he said finally. Barely. You'd need to stay purely with structure and pattern. No names, no dollar amounts, no specific terms. He paused. You're good enough to do it if you're careful. I'm careful, she said. You've been careful tonight, he said, and also you went and stood in the center of the ballroom and confronted your fiancé in front of 200 people. Those two things are both true simultaneously. She almost smiled. I'll be the other kind of careful this time. She started to move. Lydia. She stopped. Thane has filed emergency injunctions in under 2 hours before, Adrian said. If he's already drafting, then I have less time than I thought, she said, which means I move now. She walked. The room saw her coming this time. That was different from before. Before she had moved through it with intention but without announcement. Now the room tracked her across the floor with the attention it gives to someone who has already established that they are worth watching. She found the councilwomen first, Renata Vos and Patricia Sharp, 2 of the 7 city council members who would have been present for her counter-analysis 6 weeks ago. They were standing near the piano with the attentive, calculating expression of politicians who have been at a social event that unexpectedly became relevant to their professional interests. Councilwoman Voss, Lydia said, Ms. Sharp, I need 2 minutes. They gave her 4. She used them carefully. She didn't tell them about the Aldertons specifically. She told them about the pattern, the structure of the arrangements, the way the contract provisions were designed, the use of assessment subsidiaries that reported back to the originating party. She told them about the Meridian Holdings connection to the Harbor District development proposal that the council had been reviewing. She told them, carefully, that the development proposal, the one that had been submitted to the council 3 months ago, the one her counter-analysis had challenged, contained the same structural relationship between its financing arm and its assessment authority. Patricia Sharp looked at Renata Vos. "The review period for that proposal closes in 9 days," Sharp said. "Yes," Lydia said. Another look between them. The compressed, efficient communication of two people who have worked together long enough to conduct entire conversations with their eyes. Then Voss turned back to Lydia. "If you have documentation, my associate does. It's in process. You'll have it in 48 hours. And if what you're suggesting about the financing arm is accurate, then the proposal should not pass review," Lydia said, "not without significant restructuring of the assessment provision." Sharp's jaw was set. She was a practical woman. Lydia had always respected that about her. A woman who had spent 20 years in a room full of men who underestimated her and had learned to use their underestimation as a navigation tool. "Send me the documentation when it's ready," she said. "Through official channels, proper format." "Of course." "And Lydia." Sharp looked at her with the directness that Lydia had always found refreshing and slightly terrifying. "Be careful. What you're doing is right. But right doesn't protect you from expensive." "I know," Lydia said. "Thank you." She moved on. She found the Marchetti sisters near the east archway. Both of them, Julia and Sophie, standing close together in the way of siblings who have just learned something and are processing it side by side. Sophie saw her coming and straightened slightly. "Julia knows," Sophie said when Lydia reached them. "I told her." Julia Marchetti was 24, the elder sister with the harder edges that came from being the one who dealt with the family's financial conversations directly. Her expression was the specific expression of someone who has just reorganized their understanding of several months of events. "Our father signed the letter of intent on Thursday," she said. "The full contract was supposed to be ready for signature next week." "Can he delay?" Lydia asked. "He can say he needs more time to review. Yes, he can delay." Her jaw was tight. "For how long?" "I need 48 hours for the documentation. After that, you'll have enough to justify pulling out entirely, and you'll have grounds to do it without triggering the early exit penalties." Julia looked at her sister. Something passed between them. Then she turned back to Lydia. "If we pull out and the documentation doesn't come through, it will," Lydia said. "You're asking me to trust that?" "Yes." She held Julia's gaze. "I know what I'm asking." Julia Marchetti studied her face for a long moment. Then, 48 hours, she said. "After that, I need something I can show my father." "You'll have it." Julia nodded once and walked toward the garden doors, already taking out her phone. Sophie stayed for 1 moment longer. "He's watching you," Sophie said quietly. "Edmund. He's been watching you for the last 10 minutes. "I know. The men he brought back, the one on the phone, I know about them too." Sophie looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. Concern, maybe, and something else. Something that looked like the specific solidarity of a person who recognizes that someone else is standing in a position they themselves narrowly avoided. "What can I do?" she said. "Keep your family from signing anything for the next 48 hours. "Done." She paused. "And after?" "After," Lydia said. "We'll see what shape this takes." She moved back toward the center of the room. Adrian met her halfway. His expression had changed. Just slightly, just enough to tell her something had shifted in the last 20 minutes. "What?" she said. "Thane just left the building." She absorbed this. "Already?" His car was out front. He was only here 40 minutes. He looked at her. He either had everything he needed or Edmund gave him instructions before coming back in. "So it's filed, or being filed, or being prepared to file first thing tomorrow morning, which gives you..." He checked his watch. 12 hours before a formal threat of action lands. 12 hours. She thought about what she had in 12 hours. Sophie's note, the documentation Adrian's people were compiling, the council women who were now potentially engaged on the development proposal angle, and the Marchetti family, who had agreed to delay. And her father, sitting in an armchair in the east sitting room, who had said, "Tell me what you need." 12 hours was not much. It was also more than she'd had an hour ago. "Then we use the 12 hours," she said. "Yes." He paused. "There's something else." She waited. "Wentworth," he said. "He came back in about 5 minutes ago, without Edmund. He's been moving through the room speaking to specific people, 6 of them, all of them connected to families that have had financial dealings with Harwell in the past 2 years. He looked at her. "He's not just observing tonight, he's running the counteroffensive himself." She looked across the room and found Wentworth, the colorless, attentive man with his notebook, now putting it away and speaking to a silver-haired man she recognized as the head of the Favre banking family. Both of them watching her. "Edmund sent him back in," she said. "Yes. Edmund removed himself from the room because his presence was a liability after what you said. But he left someone behind." Adrian's voice was level. "Wentworth's job tonight is to work the room in Edmund's absence. Talk to the financial connections. Suggest that the allegations are overblown. Create doubt about your stability, your motives, your judgment." He paused. "He'll be good at it. He's been doing it for years." Lydia watched Wentworth move away from the Favre patriarch and toward the next conversation. A man doing a job. Efficient, unhurried, invisible, in the way of someone whose usefulness depends on not being the most important person in the room. "He's also the person," Adrian said, "who actually manages the legal filing structure for the proxy companies. He's not just a social assistant, he's operational." She turned to look at Adrian. "You knew this before tonight." "I suspected it. Tonight confirmed it." He held her gaze. "If we can document Wentworth's operational role, specifically his management of the Millbridge filings, the exposure is significantly larger than just the Harwell family. It connects several of the transactions to a deliberate legal structure, not just opportunistic contract language. That's the difference between a civil dispute and potential fraud." The word sat there. Fraud. Not unfavorable contract terms. Not aggressive legal strategy. Fraud. The kind that had regulators in it, that had criminal exposure attached, that transformed the entire shape of what Edmund Harwell was into something that could not be managed through social narrative or injunction. "What do you need for that?" she said. "The Millbridge filings from the past 3 years. Specifically the ownership transfer records from 2022 when the company restructured. The public filings don't show the connection clearly, but if I cross-reference them with the consortium documents I already have..." He stopped. "I need someone who can walk me through the specific dates and transaction structures, someone who was operationally involved." Lydia thought about this. Thought about who had been operationally involved with Edmund Harwell's arrangements for the past several months. Who had been present in meetings, who had been the person Edmund trusted to manage social relationships, to keep people calm, to gather information from trusted sources. She thought about Clara. Clara, who kept records. Clara, who had said this is starting to feel wrong. Clara, who had looked at her in the corridor with an expression that might have been shame. "I need to make a phone call," she said. "Now?" "Yes." He stepped back without asking further questions. She moved toward the corridor, the west one this time, not the east, not the one where it had started, and took out her phone. She looked at Clara's name for a moment. Then she called. It rang 4 times. 5. She was already preparing to leave a message. The careful, specific, "this is what I need" message she had composed in her head. When the call connected. Silence on the other end. Not the silence of a voicemail, the silence of a person who has answered and is deciding whether to speak. "Clara?" Lydia said. A breath. Then, "I know why you're calling." "Then you know what I need." Another silence, longer. Through the phone she could hear ambient sound. Clara was still at the event, or just outside. She could hear the distant current of the ballroom. "What you're asking me to do," Clara said finally, "would expose me." "Yes," Lydia said, "it would." "The documents you want. If I give those to you, Edmund will know where they came from. He has people here tonight. He'll know by morning." "I know." "I lose the Fontaine contract. I lose the goodwill he's extended to the family business. I potentially lose. She stopped. A great deal. I know, Lydia said again. The silence stretched. Lydia held the phone and did not fill the silence with reassurance. She didn't promise Clara it would be fine, or that she'd be protected, or that the right choice was also the easy one. She had learned tonight, or perhaps she had always known, that the gap between what is true and what is comfortable is where the actual decisions happen, and people deserve the dignity of making those decisions without being managed. Clara had managed her for 4 months. She was not going to do the same thing back. What you built, Lydia said quietly, with those records, you built them because you're thorough, and because you know that information is the only currency that doesn't devalue. You've always known that. She paused. The question is what you do with it. The longest silence yet. Somewhere in the ballroom, the string quartet started playing again. The sound came through the phone and through the corridor wall simultaneously, 2 slightly offset versions of the same music. The Millbridge transfers, Clara said. The 2022 restructuring. There's a folder, physical copies and digital. She stopped. I can get you access to the digital copies in an hour. There's a shared drive. Edmund gave me access 18 months ago because I was coordinating the consortium communications. Another pause. He probably forgot I still have it. Lydia's hand tightened on the phone. He forgot a lot of things, Clara said, and her voice had gone to something flat and tired. About what I notice. About what I keep. A breath. I'm not doing this for you, Lydia. You understand that. I'm doing it because... You don't have to explain it to me, Lydia said. A pause. No, Clara said. I suppose I don't. And then, after a moment, I'm sorry. For the 4 months. I know that doesn't fix it. Lydia stood in the west corridor with the string music coming through 2 surfaces at once. No, she said. It doesn't. The call ended. She stood for a moment. Then she walked back into the ballroom. And stopped. Adrian was standing exactly where she'd left him, but the expression on his face was different from anything she'd seen on it all evening. Not controlled, not collecting, something sharp and immediate. What happened? She said. He looked at her. Your father, he said. Someone just brought him a letter, delivered here tonight, in person. I don't know what it says. He paused. But he's been in the East sitting room for 10 minutes, and the man who delivered it works for Marcus Thane's office. The floor didn't move, but it felt like it did. The injunction, she said. Not an injunction. His voice was careful. Something else. Something that required in-person delivery on a Saturday evening. He held her gaze. Something aimed at your father specifically. She was already moving. She moved through the ballroom fast, not running, not quite, but with the specific urgent pace of someone who has just understood that the front she was managing was not the only front. That while she had been working the room, speaking to councilwomen and Marchetti sisters, and standing in west corridors on careful phone calls, Edmund Harwell had been doing something else entirely. Not through Wentworth, not through Thane in the ballroom, through her father. The east sitting room was 30 feet away, then 20. Then she pushed the door open. Her father was standing by the window with a single page of paper in his hand. His face had the color of a man who has just understood something he cannot ununderstand. He looked up when she came in, and what she saw in his expression was not fear, exactly, but something heavier, the look of a man who has just discovered that the ground is further down than he thought. Dad, she crossed the room. What does it say? He looked at the paper, then at her. His voice, when it came, was very quiet. It says, he said, that Harwell holds a secondary lien on the Hale family property, filed 18 months ago, through a holding company. He looked at her. Before he ever approached us about the engagement, the room went very still. He had the lien before, she said. Her voice sounded strange to her. Before the engagement, before any of it, her father said. Which means the engagement was never about the alliance, she said. It was about the lien. The engagement was the distraction, the thing that kept us from looking at the property structure while he waited for... She stopped. Her mind was doing the thing, running fast, mapping the shape of it. He doesn't need the engagement to trigger the lien. He can do it independently. The lien gives him leverage over the property, regardless of what happens with the contract. Her father's hand holding the paper was not steady. How long has he had this? Lydia said. 18 months. Then he's been waiting. Yes. For what? Her father looked at her. His eyes were tired and honest and completely without pretense. The note says the lien becomes callable in 30 days, he said. If it's called, we lose the property, she said. We lose everything the property is collateral for, he said. Which is everything, she finished. Outside in the ballroom, the string quartet was playing. 200 people were still talking, still rebuilding their calculations, still processing what had happened in the last hour. Adrian Voss was somewhere in that room with 48 hours of documentation in progress and a shared drive he didn't yet know existed, and 12 hours before a legal threat arrived. Lydia stood in the east sitting room with her father and a single page of paper and the complete understanding that Edmund Harwell had not, tonight, been trying to win the room. He had been letting her have it, because he didn't need the room. He had never needed the room. He had something far worse, and he had been holding it for 18 months, waiting for exactly the right moment to use it. The 30 days started tonight. 30 days. Lydia stood in the east sitting room and let herself have exactly 60 seconds with the full weight of it. Not because she was the kind of person who needed to fall apart before she could function. She wasn't, particularly. But because she had learned, somewhere in the architecture of a very long evening, that ignoring the actual size of a problem didn't make you tougher. It just made you surprised later. So she stood there. She looked at her father's face and the paper in his hand, and she let herself understand completely what they were looking at. Edmund Harwell had held a lien on the Hale property for 18 months. He had structured the engagement not as a trap built during courtship, but as a cover story laid over a trap that already existed. While her family had been believing they were in a negotiation, while she had been believing she was making a strategic choice, a hard choice, a choice that cost her something but protected the people she loved. He had been waiting, patient, unhurried, the way a man waits when he already has what he needs and is simply deciding when to use it. The engagement had been theater. She had been a prop in it, 60 seconds. Then she said, "How is the lien structured? Is it a single instrument or tiered?" Her father blinked. He had expected she could see something other than that. Tears, maybe, or the collapse that the situation seemed to call for. Instead, she was standing in front of him asking about legal structure, and she could see him adjust, shift gears, recognize that his daughter had moved past the initial shock faster than he had, and decide to follow her lead. "Single instrument," he said. He looked at the paper again. "Filed through a company called Harrow Property Partners. I've never heard of them." "Harrow Property Partners," she said. "Hold on." She took out her phone, sent a text to Adrian. 3 words. Harrow Property Partners. Now. Then she looked back at her father. "Is there anything in the note about conditions? About what would satisfy the lien before the 30 days, full repayment of the underlying debt instrument," her father said, "which is structured at—" He stopped. He looked at the number on the page and his expression did something complicated. "It's not the debt figure we were originally dealing with," he said quietly. "There are penalty provisions. For time elapsed. The original figure was—" He named it. Then he named what it had grown to with the penalty structure. Lydia didn't react outwardly. Inside, something very cold moved through her. It was a large number. It was a specifically calibrated large number. Large enough to be almost certainly impossible for the Hale family to address independently within 30 days, but not so large as to be obviously impossible, which would have been too aggressive. It was the exact size of overwhelming without being absurd, and it had been chosen, she was sure, with care. "He knew what he was doing when he picked that number," she said. "Yes. Because it's just small enough that I might spend the 30 days trying to solve it before I understood what I was actually dealing with." She was thinking out loud now. If I spend the 30 days chasing financing, chasing options, trying to address the instrument directly, then I'm distracted. I'm not building the documentation case. I'm not working with the council women or the Marchetti family or any of the other threads from tonight. She looked at her father. The lien is the distraction, like the engagement was the distraction. Peace. Her father looked at her for a moment. You think he's running the same play? I think he only has one play, she said. He identifies a target's most critical vulnerability, and then he builds a structure around it that makes the target manage the vulnerability instead of managing him. She paused. Which means the way to beat it is to stop managing the vulnerability and start managing him. Her phone vibrated, a text from Adrian. In the corridor, come now. She looked at her father. I need to go, stay here. Don't let anyone in this room who you didn't invite. And if anyone else delivers anything, any document, any letter, anything, don't sign anything and don't acknowledge receipt. Just call me. Lydia, I have this, she said. She said it with more certainty than she actually possessed, which was a choice she made deliberately. Her father needed to believe she had it, because if he didn't believe it, he would start managing the vulnerability himself, calling people, making calls, trying to solve the number. And that was exactly what Edmund wanted. She touched his shoulder briefly and went back into the corridor. Adrian was in the west corridor on his phone, speaking in a low, rapid voice to someone she couldn't identify. He held up a finger as she approached. One moment, and she waited, watching his face, which was doing something she hadn't seen it do all evening. He wasn't collecting information. He was processing something he'd already received and didn't entirely like. He ended the call. Harrow Property Partners, he said immediately. It's not a Harwell company directly. It's registered to a trust in the name of Elaine Voss. The name landed like something thrown at a wall. Lydia stared at him. Voss. My aunt, he said, flat. My father's sister. She and my father had a significant legal dispute over the estate assets when I inherited. She received a settlement. She has had ongoing business dealings that I am aware of in general terms, but not in specific ones. His jaw was set. I did not know about this specific instrument. The silence between them was a different quality than any of the silences of the evening. Adrian, I know what this looks like, he said. What does it look like? He looked at her directly. It looks like the man who offered to help you tonight has family connections to the mechanism that's being used against your family. It looks like either I'm compromised or I'm being used as an unwitting piece in something larger, or... He stopped. Or there's a third option I haven't fully mapped yet. She studied his face. She was looking for the things she'd been trained to look for in every social interaction. The adjustment, the recalibration, the performance of honesty rather than honesty itself. The shift in the eyes that preceded a managed response. She didn't find it. What she found instead was genuine anger. Not the performed anger of someone defending a position, but the specific controlled fury of a person who has just discovered that their name is attached to something without their knowledge, and who is running the implications at full speed. You didn't know, she said. It wasn't a question. No. His voice was tight, but not knowing doesn't fix it. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She thought for a moment. Your aunt, what's her relationship with Edmund Harwell? I'm going to find out in approximately... He looked at his phone. 3 minutes. I have someone pulling the connection records. If she's been working with him, then the lien isn't just a Harwell instrument, he said. It's a joint play, which is more complex, but also... He stopped. Something shifted in his expression. Also potentially more useful to us. She saw where he was going. Because if it's a joint instrument and the connection between your family and Harwell can be exposed, then the lien's legitimacy becomes questionable, he said. If it can be shown that the instrument was filed as part of a coordinated scheme, not just as a standard financial tool, there are grounds for challenging its enforceability. He paused. It's not a guaranteed win, but it's a thread. Pull it, she said. His phone vibrated. He looked at it. His expression shifted again. Faster this time, the specific quality of someone reading data points that are connecting faster than expected. She's been on the Meridian Holdings board for 2 years, he said. As a silent director, she's not listed in the public filings, but she's in the internal incorporation documents. He looked up. Edmund didn't build Meridian. She did. He came in as the operating face 18 months ago, when the first instruments started being filed. He looked at her. She built the structure. He runs it. Lydia stood very still. That's why the proxy company architecture is so clean, she said. Edmund isn't sophisticated enough for that. He's good with people. He's good at identifying targets and managing relationships. But the legal architecture of Meridian is too careful for someone who just learned from his father's lawyers. She thought about it. Someone built that. Someone who knew what they were doing. My aunt, Adrian said, was a corporate lawyer for 14 years before she moved into private investment. His voice was perfectly level. She is very sophisticated. And she's been running this with Edmund for 18 months. Yes. Another silence. Then Lydia said, Can you turn her? He looked at her. She and Edmund have been partners for 18 months, Lydia said. But she built the structure and he runs the front, which means all the social exposure tonight, the room, the allegations, the councilwomen, that's landing on Edmund, not on her. She's protected by the proxy structure. She looked at Adrian. But not if we expose the structure itself. And right now, in the next 12 hours, the choice she's looking at is stay aligned with Edmund, who is damaged after tonight, who has a defamation lawyer filing papers in the morning, who is going to spend the next month in an increasingly complicated legal position as the documentation comes together. She paused. Or restructure her exposure before the documentation is complete. You're suggesting she'd turn on him. I'm suggesting she'd save herself, Lydia said. Those are related but different. Adrian was very quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. The relationship, the history, the specific calculation of a woman who had built something carefully over 18 months and was now watching its operating face become a liability. She won't meet with me directly, he said. Our relationship is, he searched for the word, documented in its hostility. A direct approach from me reads as confrontational. Then don't make a direct approach, Lydia said. Then who? Let me talk to her. He stared at her. You have never met Elaine Voss. No, but she knows my name after tonight, because the lien on my family's property is filed in her company's name. Lydia kept her voice even. And I'm the person she should be most interested in talking to right now, because I'm the one person in this situation who can do the most damage to the structure she built. Or, alternatively, the one person who might be willing to negotiate the shape of that damage, if she gives me something worth negotiating for. She won't just talk to a stranger who calls her. She'll talk to anyone who knows specifically enough about the Millbridge restructuring to demonstrate that they have enough information to make her life very complicated, Lydia said. Claire is giving me access to the shared drive in, she checked her watch, less than an hour. Once I have those files, I have enough to show I know the structure. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. That's aggressive. Yes. It's also, he paused. It's actually the right move. He said it in the slightly reluctant tone of someone recognizing that a plan they didn't generate is better than the one they would have generated. If she believes the documentation case is already far enough advanced, she'll calculate that the cost of staying with Edmund outweighs the cost of a strategic exit, Lydia said, which it does. We just need her to understand that we know that before she's convinced herself otherwise. And if she says no, if she holds the lien regardless, then we're in the same position we're in now, Lydia said, which is already bad. We have nothing to lose by trying. He was quiet for one more moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out a business card. Plain, heavy paper, just the name and a phone number. He turned it over and wrote another number on the back. That's her direct line, he said. She answers it at all hours. She always has. Lydia took the card. Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. She's going to be difficult. She's been difficult since she was 43, and she's been at it for another 12 years. I'm not expecting easy, Lydia said. I stopped expecting easy about 4 hours ago. She made the call from the garden. The Whitmore estate garden was cold at this hour. Late autumn, the kind of cold that didn't quite bite but reminded you that winter was forming its intention. The lights from the ballroom cut yellow rectangles across the stone path. She could hear the party through the glass, still going, still populated, the social world continuing its operations around the event she had put at its center. She dialed. It rang twice. Who is this? Not a question, a demand. A voice like a verdict. Precise, unsentimental, accustomed to delivering information and expecting it delivered back in kind. My name is Lydia Hale, she said. Your company holds a lien on my family's property. Silence. 2 seconds. 3. How did you get this number? That's not the relevant question, Lydia said. The relevant question is what happens in the next 30 days, and whether the shape of that is something you've fully calculated. Another silence. Lydia held the cold of the garden and waited. She did not fill the silence. She was learning that silence, deployed correctly, did work that words couldn't. You had quite an evening, Elaine Voss said finally. I did. You made a number of serious allegations in a public room. I made accurate statements, Lydia said. Whether they're serious depends on what was actually done. A distinction that a defamation lawyer would find interesting. Marcus Thane is not a defamation lawyer, Lydia said. He's a filing lawyer. He's very good at the mechanics of legal instruments. He's considerably less good at the strategic picture when the documentation on the other side is already further advanced than he knows. She paused. Which is his problem and your problem, not mine. The silence on the other end of the phone was different from the one before, more attentive. The silence of someone recalibrating. What do you want? Elaine said. I want the lien released, Lydia said. Yes. I want the Millbridge files, and I want the structure of the Meridian Board disclosed formally, including your directorship. That's not a negotiation, that's a list of demands. The negotiation, Lydia said, is in what you get, which is that the documentation case we're building, the one that connects Meridian Holdings to 4 families, the one that traces the Millbridge restructuring through 2 proxy layers, the one that identifies the assessment subsidiary arrangement, that case, when it goes to the council and subsequently to the relevant regulatory bodies, can be structured to reflect the difference between the person who built a legal framework and the person who operated it as an instrument of deliberate exploitation. She kept her voice level. That's not the same charge. Those are not the same consequences. A long pause. You're offering me a distinction. I'm offering you the accurate description of what happened, Lydia said, which is that Edmund Harwell identified families in financial distress and used a system to exploit them. You built the system. Those are different things, and a careful presentation of the evidence can make that difference visible, or it can choose not to. And in exchange, the lien released, the files, the disclosure, she paused, and the name of every family Meridian has approached in the past 3 years. Silence. That last item, Elaine said, would require Edmund's records, which you have access to. Which I had access to, she said. Our arrangement has become, she stopped, complicated in the past several hours. There it was. The seam. Lydia kept her voice entirely neutral. How complicated? He filed an instrument tonight without consulting me, Elaine said. And the flatness in her voice was a different kind of flat than the controlled professional surface. It was the flatness of a person who has just discovered that a partner they trusted to run the front of their operation has made a unilateral move. The lien delivery, that was his decision, not mine. Lydia absorbed this. Edmund had delivered the lien tonight without Elaine's knowledge, which meant he had panicked after the ballroom confrontation and reached for the most aggressive tool available, the one that could silence her, distract her, trap her family, without consulting the woman who had actually built the structure and who had, presumably, a more calibrated sense of when to deploy it. He had overplayed, and in doing so he had exposed the seam between himself and his partner. He panicked, Lydia said. He is, Elaine said, with the controlled disdain of someone describing a failed instrument, not as good as he thinks he is. No, Lydia said, he's not. Another silence. This one felt different, like the air before a decision. The families, Elaine said. I'll give you the names. And the files. She paused. The lien. I need until morning. There are mechanics involved in releasing it that can't be done from a phone at this hour. Morning is acceptable. And the distinction you mentioned, in how the documentation is presented. You have my word, Lydia said. That's all I have to give you tonight. A word from someone who's known for less than an evening. A word from someone who's demonstrated tonight that she does what she says she's going to do, Lydia said. You can evaluate that however you like. The longest silence of the conversation. Then, I'll send the files to your number within the hour. A pause. I have some advice for you, unsolicited. Go ahead. Edmund won't take tonight quietly, Elaine said. The lien was a panic move, but he has other instruments. Not through me. I'm done being his infrastructure, but through other channels. Another pause. He is, at his core, a man who cannot tolerate being outmaneuvered by someone he underestimated. It makes him reckless. Her voice was entirely level. Be ready for reckless. The line went dead. Lydia stood in the garden for a moment. The cold had gotten into her fingers. She hadn't noticed until now. She went back inside. The files arrived 43 minutes later. While the party was still technically ongoing, though thinning now into its final hour, the crowd reduced to the committed and the genuinely social. Lydia sat in the east sitting room with her father and Adrian and a laptop that Adrian had retrieved from his car, and they went through the Millbridge files with the specific, methodical attention of people who understand that what they're looking for might not announce itself. What they found was worse than expected and better structured than feared. Worse than expected, the list of families Elaine had included with the files. 11 names. Not 4. 11 families who had been approached through the Meridian framework in various stages of the arrangement, ranging from initial contact to fully executed contracts with embedded provisions. Some names Lydia recognized from the ballroom tonight. Others she didn't know at all. Families from neighboring districts. Families outside the immediate social circle. People Edmund Harwell had identified through channels she hadn't yet mapped. Better structured than feared. The documentation trail in the Millbridge files was clean. Elaine Voss had been a corporate lawyer for 14 years, and it showed. She kept records in a way that was thorough, organized, and internally consistent. Each instrument, each filing, each ownership transfer was documented with reference numbers and dates, and the specific language of someone who knew exactly what chain of evidence she was creating. It was, Lydia thought with a complicated feeling, almost admirable. It was also a complete record of exactly what had been done and to whom. This is enough, Adrian said. He said it quietly, with the specific quality of someone who has been building a case for 8 months and has just received the piece that makes everything else cohere. The councilwomen, this is enough for Sharp and Voss to open a formal review. The Harbor District proposal fails automatically once the Meridian Board connection is disclosed, because the conflict of interest provisions are clear. He scrolled through the files. The Alderton NDA becomes void if the instrument it's protecting is shown to be part of a fraudulent scheme. There's precedent. Specific precedent. I know the case. He looked at Lydia. This is enough to end it. Tonight? The formal process takes longer than tonight, he said. But the shape of the outcome is fixed tonight. There's a difference between a fight where you might lose and a fight where you've already won, but have to wait for the paperwork. Her father, who had been sitting very quietly through the past 43 minutes, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 40 years of business, he said, and I've never heard it put quite that way. It's accurate, Adrian said unapologetically. Lydia was looking at the list of 11 families, 11 names on a page, each one representing a set of people who had been sitting with a problem they thought was financial and was actually something someone had done to them deliberately. She thought about how many of those families had done what she'd almost done, accepted the situation, managed the anxiety, performed contentment in rooms like this one while the legal architecture tightened around them. We have to contact them, she said. We will, Adrian said. Not tonight. Tonight? I know. Tonight we secure what we have. She looked at him. And in the morning? In the morning, he said. The lien is released, and we start making calls. She nodded, looked at the screen, looked at the files. She was exhausted in a way that had settled into her bones. Not the tiredness of a long evening, but the tiredness that comes from running on pure forward momentum for hours, from making decision after decision in conditions that didn't allow for adequate information, from holding the weight of multiple moving pieces and refusing to let any of them drop. She was also, she realized, more awake than she'd felt in 6 months. "I need to ask you something," she said to Adrian. He looked at her. "Your aunt, what happens to her?" He was quiet for a moment. "She'll face a regulatory review, depending on what the council finds and what the other families decide to pursue. She could face civil liability." He paused. "Criminal is possible, but less likely. She's too careful." "She built the system that hurt 11 families." "Yes. But she also gave us the files and released the lien." "She gave us the files and is releasing the lien because it was in her best interest to do so," Adrian said, with a directness that wasn't cruel, but wasn't soft. "That's not the same as remorse. I wouldn't conflate the two." "I'm not conflating them," Lydia said. "I'm asking what happens to her because I need to understand the shape of the outcome I'm building toward. The distinction I offered her, I meant it. I don't mean it to protect her from consequences. I mean it to be accurate." She paused. "Edmund used the system she built to deliberately target people. That's what happened. The documentation should reflect that accurately, not more harshly and not more kindly." Adrian looked at her for a moment. "You're going to make the process very difficult for the people who would prefer a simpler story," he said. "Good," she said. Her father cleared his throat. Both of them looked at him. He had the expression of a man who has spent the last several hours watching his daughter operate in a register he hadn't fully understood she possessed, and who is in the process of updating his understanding. "It's past 1 in the morning," he said. "We're all still in this building in formal wear with a laptop. Can I suggest that at some point before dawn—" "Go home, Dad," Lydia said, with the particular combination of affection and firmness that is unique to parent-adult-child relationships. "I'll be there in an hour." "You'll be safe?" She looked at him, thought about what Elaine Voss had said. He cannot tolerate being outmaneuvered by someone he underestimated. It makes him reckless. Be ready for reckless. "I'll be careful," she said. "That's the better guarantee." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he folded the lien notice neatly and put it in his jacket pocket. Not throwing it away, she noticed, not pretending it didn't exist, just containing it, and stood up. He was tired. He looked every one of his 61 years. But he also looked, she thought, like a man who has discovered that the person he'd been trying to protect was already capable of protecting both of them. "Come home," he said, "when you can." Then he left. The room was quieter with just the two of them in it. The laptop screen glowed. From the ballroom, the final sounds of a party reaching its end, the string quartet packing up, conversations acquiring the particular quality of conclusions. "There's going to be pushback," Adrian said. "Not as a warning, just as a fact, stated plainly. When the formal review opens, when the council votes on the Harbor District proposal, Harwell has financial connections that will defend him. Not because they believe in him, but because what we're exposing threatens the broader structure that benefits them." "I know." "The defamation filing may still arrive tomorrow morning." "I know. Let Thane file it. Let him file it publicly. Because now we have the Millbridge documentation, and a defamation case requires him to prove that what I said was false." She looked at Adrian. "Can he prove any of it was false?" "No," Adrian said. "Then let him file," she said. "It puts everything in a public record, which is exactly where I want it." He looked at her with the expression he'd worn in the ballroom when she'd taken his arm, the specific, assessing look of someone confirming a judgment they'd already tentatively made. Then he turned back to the laptop. "I need to call 2 people tonight," he said. "One is a regulatory attorney who specializes in exactly this kind of instrument. The other is a financial journalist who has been trying to break a story on Meridian Holdings for 6 months and hasn't been able to because she didn't have the documentation." He paused. "With your permission." She thought about it. A journalist was a significant escalation. It took the story out of the social room and put it somewhere permanent. It removed the possibility of the whole thing being managed quietly, resolved through back channels, absorbed back into the social world without permanent record. It also meant that Edmund Harwell's recklessness would have consequences he couldn't buy or litigate his way out of. "Call her," Lydia said. He picked up his phone. "Tom." At 2:30 in the morning, the Whitmore estate was nearly empty. A few late-staying guests clustered near the entrance, waiting for cars. The staff moved through the ballroom in the efficient, invisible way of people whose job begins when the event ends, collecting glasses, folding linens, restoring the room to the version of itself that existed before 200 people had used it to stage an evening that several of them would be thinking about for a long time. Lydia stood near the main entrance with her coat on and her bag in her hand, watching a room she had studied for 4 years return to itself. Adrian appeared beside her. "The attorney is briefed," he said. "He's reviewing the files tonight. He'll have an assessment by 8. He paused. "The journalist, her name is Dara Kessler. She writes for the Financial Monitor. She's already pulling the public filing correlations we identified. She said she has a source inside the Alderton family who has been wanting to speak for months." "Margaret Alderton," Lydia said, remembering Lady Hargrove. "She's not weak. She's been isolated." "Not isolated anymore," Adrian said. A car arrived at the entrance. Lydia watched it pull up. "Not hers. She'd called for one, but it wasn't here yet." "Adrian?" She turned to look at him. "Why did you come tonight? Originally? Before any of this?" He was quiet for a moment. "I had information that told me something significant was about to happen with the Harwell Consortium interference. I thought coming tonight might clarify the timeline." He paused. "That's the practical answer." "And the other answer?" He looked at the room. "I've been operating alone for 8 months on this," he said. "By design. I don't generally—" He stopped, chose different words. "I don't generally find it useful to involve other people in things I can handle independently. And tonight? Tonight I met someone who was already 3 steps ahead of where I thought the situation was, who was operating on worse information than I had, with higher personal stakes, and who was still making the right calls." He looked at her. "I've been running this case for 8 months. You walked into it 4 hours ago." A pause. That clarified something. Lydia looked at him. She was too tired for anything elaborate, which meant what she felt came through without the social architecture she usually built around her responses. "I don't actually know how this ends," she said. "I know tonight went. I know we got what we needed tonight. But the 30 days, the 11 families, the regulatory process and the journalist and the defamation filing and whatever Edmund decides to do when he understands that the lien instrument isn't going to work." She paused. "I don't know how all of that resolves." "No," he said. "You don't. Neither do I. That's not reassuring." "It's accurate," he said, "which I've found is generally more useful." She almost smiled. She was too tired to fully manage it, so what came out was something genuine and slightly crooked, and not at all the contained expression she'd been practicing in mirrors. "You say that a lot," she said. "Accurate." "It's a consistent priority," he said. A second car pulled up. Hers this time. The driver got out. She picked up her bag. Then she stopped. "Lady Hargrove came to find me about an hour ago," she said. "Before she left, she said something." "What did she say?" Lydia thought about the old woman with her 70 years and her 4 survived scandals and her way of moving through rooms like she owned the concept of rooms. She had found Lydia near the piano, taken her by the arm, and said one thing, briefly, in the low, precise voice of someone delivering a final verdict. She said, "You'll be talked about differently tomorrow than you were today. That's not the same as being safe, but it's the beginning of something." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "She's right," he said. "I know." Lydia looked at the ballroom one last time, the staff still moving, the chandeliers dimmed to half their earlier brightness, the long tables bare of glasses and flowers, the marble floor empty and pale. The room that 200 people had watched her walk through tonight. The room where she had stood in the center and said the true thing out loud. "I know she's right." She walked to her car. She was halfway down the entrance steps when she heard him behind her. "Lydia." She turned. He was standing in the doorway, his jacket still impeccable even at 2:30 in the morning, his expression doing the thing it sometimes did where it held more than it showed. "The Harbor District Development Proposal," he said. "The counter-analysis you submitted to the council 6 weeks ago. The one they didn't use." "Yes?" When the Meridian connection is formally disclosed and the proposal goes back for review, he said, they'll need a revised analysis, one that takes the new information into account. A pause. I have an interest in that district. I've been working on an alternative proposal for 4 months. It would benefit from a co-author who understands the structural weaknesses in the original document. She looked at him. That's a job offer, she said. That's an accurate description of a professional arrangement that would benefit both parties, he said. I don't generally use the word offer for things that are obviously sensible. She stood on the steps of the Whitmore estate at 2:30 in the morning, exhausted and sharp and alive in a way she hadn't been in 6 months, and she looked at Adrian Voss in his doorway and understood that this was the first moment of something that was still entirely undefined. I'll think about it, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile exactly, the structural predecessor to one. That's acceptable, he said. She got in her car. As it pulled away from the estate, she looked out the window at the city moving past. Lit windows, late traffic, the ordinary nighttime world that had continued unchanged while everything in her own life had shifted irrevocably in the space of a few hours. Somewhere in the city, Marcus Thane was probably still working on a filing that was about to become a liability rather than a weapon. Somewhere, Elaine Voss was looking at her own calculations with the cold clarity of a woman who had just realized she'd moved a step too slowly. Somewhere, 11 families were sleeping without knowing that tomorrow the shape of their situation was going to be different. And somewhere, Edmund Harwell was doing what Elaine had warned her about, being reckless. She held that last thought. She was ready for it. For the first time in 6 months, she was not managing a situation she hadn't chosen. She was building something that didn't have a finished shape yet, something that would require more work and more risk and more days like this one, but something that was hers, built on what she actually knew, what she could actually do, what she was actually willing to fight for. The city went by. The car was warm. She did not sleep, but she let herself rest. That was enough for now. She got 4 hours of sleep. Not because 4 hours was enough, it wasn't, and she knew it, but because her body eventually overruled her brain somewhere around 4 in the morning and simply stopped. She woke at 8 with the specific clarity of someone who has slept hard in a short window, that strange, hyper-focused alertness that comes before exhaustion catches up. She lay in her childhood bed for 30 seconds, looking at the ceiling she'd looked at for 20 years, the water stain near the window that her father had always meant to fix. And then she got up. Her phone had 14 messages. She read them in order, standing in her kitchen in yesterday's clothes while the coffee brewed, sorting them into categories the way she sorted everything. Actionable, informational, requires response, can wait. Adrian. Attorney reviewed files. 3 specific instruments in the Millbridge restructuring are challengeable under existing statute. He's preparing a formal opinion. Call me at 9. Derek Hessler, the journalist, through a number Adrian had forwarded. I have 3 sources now, including the Alderton family. Story is being reviewed by our legal team this morning. Publishing timeline. 48 hours unless something breaks sooner. I need a statement from you by noon. Renata Vos, City Council. I've spoken with Patricia. We're convening an emergency review session Monday morning on the Harbor District proposal. We'll need you present. Please confirm. Sophie Marchetti. My father didn't sign. We held. Call me when you can. Lady Hargrove. Margaret Alderton called me at 7 this morning. She says to tell you she's ready to speak. She's been waiting 8 months for a reason to. And then at the bottom of the list, a number she didn't recognize. The message was 4 words. We should meet. E.H. Edmund. She put the phone face down on the counter and poured her coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the small, ordinary garden behind her family's house, the one her mother had planted 30 years ago, and her father had maintained with the inconsistent devotion of a man who wasn't a gardener but couldn't bear to let it go entirely. It needed work. It had always needed work. The hydrangeas along the back wall were overgrown, and the stone path had weeds coming through the gaps, and one of the planters had cracked at some point and been replaced with something that didn't quite match. It was imperfect and alive and utterly familiar, and she stood there for 2 full minutes just looking at it, because in a few minutes she was going to start making calls, and the day was going to be relentless, and she needed this 2 minutes of something ordinary. Then she picked up the phone and called Adrian. They met at 9 at a small restaurant 3 blocks from the estate, the kind of place that opened early and filled with people who needed coffee and quiet rather than occasion. Adrian was already there when she arrived, with a laptop and 2 cups of coffee and the composed, slightly hollowed look of a man who had also slept approximately 4 hours. "You look terrible," she said, sitting down. "I look functional," he said. "Those are different things." She almost smiled. "Your phrase." "It's an accurate phrase. Good morning." "Edmund texted me." He looked up from the laptop. "When?" "Last night. 4 words. We should meet." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "No context." "He's gauging whether you'll engage," Adrian said. "If you respond, he knows you're either uncertain or willing to negotiate. If you don't," he paused, "he'll read it as confidence and escalate. So it's a test either way." "Most things are with him." He turned the laptop toward her. "The attorney's opinion. Sections 2 and 4 are most relevant." She read. The coffee got cold while she read. The attorney, a man named Calloway, whose writing style was dense but precise, had identified 3 instruments in the Millbridge restructuring that violated provisions of the Regional Financial Instruments Act, a piece of legislation that most people in Edmund's social world considered too technical to bother understanding. Elaine Voss, it turned out, had known about it. The internal filing notes in her documents referenced the act specifically, with annotations indicating she had structured the instruments to be as close to the legal line as possible. But close to the line and on the correct side of the line were different things. Calloway's opinion was that 2 of the instruments were on the wrong side. Not ambiguously, clearly. "This is fraud," Lydia said. "This is documented fraud," Adrian said. "Which is different. Documented fraud has a case number." She looked at the opinion for another moment. "If this goes to prosecution, it will go to prosecution," he said. "The regulatory body doesn't have a choice once the council review opens, and the council review opens Monday." He paused. "The question is timeline and scope. Calloway thinks the Millbridge instruments are the core. If those are successfully prosecuted, the entire Meridian structure unwinds. And the 11 families. Civil recovery process. It takes time. Some of them will get more back than others depending on how far along their contracts were." He looked at her steadily. "It's not perfect." "Nothing's perfect," she said. "Will they be free of the contracts?" "Yes," he said. "That part is clean. Contracts built on a fraudulent foundation are void." He paused. "That includes the Hale lien, regardless of whether Elaine releases it formally." "She'll release it," Lydia said. "She said she would." "And you believe her?" She thought about Elaine's voice on the phone, precise, unsentimental, the voice of a woman who had decided where her interests lay and was following them without sentiment or hesitation. "I believe she calculates correctly," Lydia said. "I believe she understood that holding the lien after last night would cost her more than releasing it." She paused. "That's not the same as trusting her, but it produces the same outcome." Adrian nodded. "The journalist needs your statement by noon." "I know." She turned the laptop back toward him. "What do you recommend I say?" He looked at her. "What do you want to say?" She thought about it. She thought about the 11 families on Elaine's list, most of whom didn't know yet that last night had happened. She thought about Margaret Alderton, who had been waiting 8 months. She thought about Sophie Marchetti's father, who hadn't signed, and Julia Marchetti's jaw set tight, and Lady Hargrove saying, "That's not the same as being safe, but it's the beginning of something." "I want to say the true thing," she said, simply, without making it about me. "Then say that," he said. She opened the Notes app on her phone and wrote for 20 minutes, crossing things out, starting again, the coffee cold beside her. Adrian worked beside her on the laptop, not watching, not interfering, just present, which was, she was beginning to understand, his particular skill set. He was genuinely good at being present without making his presence into pressure. The statement, when she was done, was 4 paragraphs. It named no individuals by name. It described the structure of what had been done, the framework, the families, the legal instruments, in language clear enough for a general readership and specific enough to constitute a public record. The last paragraph said that the documentation would be provided to the relevant regulatory bodies and that any family who believed they had been affected by the Meridian Holdings framework was invited to contact the attorney whose name she provided. She read it back twice. Then she sent it to Dara Kessler. She looked up. "Now, Edmund," she said, "you've decided to respond?" "I've decided to meet him," she said. "On my terms. In public." She looked at Adrian. "You said he's reckless when he's been outmaneuvered by someone he underestimated. I want to see what reckless looks like up close, in a setting where reckless has consequences for him and not for me." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "That's either strategically sound or personally risky." "Probably both," she said. "You said that about last night. Last night worked out." "Last night isn't finished," she said, "and neither is he." She texted Edmund back at 10:15. "Today, noon, the Langford Hotel lobby, public." His response came in 40 seconds. "Fine." No argument about the location, no counterproposal. Just fine, which told her something. He was more rattled than the 4-word text had suggested, or he had something specific he wanted to say, and he wanted to say it quickly. She couldn't tell which, and not being able to tell was itself information. She spent the intervening 90 minutes on the phone. Renata Vos, confirmed for the Monday council session, explained what she needed in terms of formal documentation, asked 3 precise questions about the Meridian board structure that Lydia answered from memory, having spent 2 hours with the files the previous night. The conversation lasted 22 minutes and ended with Voss saying, in the tone of a politician who has just recalibrated an assessment, "You should have been at that council session 6 weeks ago." In the room, not just on paper. Margaret Alderton was next. She called the number Lady Hargrove had given her, and Margaret picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. She was 53, and her voice sounded like someone who had been carrying a weight in a specific posture for 8 months, and was now, carefully, adjusting. She didn't need convincing. She had been ready for 8 months. The NDA had not changed her understanding of what had happened, only her ability to speak it. Now Lydia explained, in specific terms, why the NDA was no longer enforceable. Margaret was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, "My husband wanted to handle it quietly. Keep the family out of the public discussion." A pause. "I told him 8 months ago that quiet was only protecting the person who had the most to hide." Her voice was steady. "I'd like to speak with your journalist. I'll send you her contact information. And Lydia," the older woman's voice shifted slightly, less formal, more direct. "What you did at that party, it couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Lydia said honestly. "No, it never is." A pause. "Thank you." She hung up and sat with that for a moment. Then she called Sophie Marchetti, who answered with an audible exhale of relief and the words, "My father thinks you're either brilliant or insane." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Lydia said. Sophie laughed. The real one this time, not the social performance version. Lydia recognized the difference and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. "He wants to know what to do now," Sophie said. "Formally. He wants someone to tell him the right steps." "Calloway," Lydia said. "The attorney Adrian introduced me to. Have your father call him today. He'll walk him through the contract review and what the void declaration means for the negotiation timeline." "Okay." A pause. "And you? How are you actually doing?" The question had the same quality as her father's. "Are you all right from the previous night?" Simple, direct, without agenda. She was surrounded, apparently, by people who asked things directly. She was starting to understand how rare that was. "I'm functional," she said. Sophie snorted. "That sounds like something someone says when they're not fine but are too busy to deal with it." "Yes," Lydia said. "That's exactly what it is." The Langford Hotel lobby was all dark wood and tall ceilings, and the kind of ambient noise that was busy without being loud. The murmur of late morning business, the sound of coffee orders, the particular hum of a place designed to make people feel important while remaining comfortably anonymous. She arrived at 5 to noon and found a table near the center, visible from the entrance, and at least 3 other tables. Edmund arrived at noon exactly. He looked different than he had last night, not damaged. He was too controlled for damage to show, but reduced somehow. The easy social confidence that had always been the surface of him had pulled back slightly, like a tide going out and revealing what was underneath. What was underneath was a man in his early 30s who had built his self-concept on the belief that he was better than the people around him at the game that everyone was playing, and who was now sitting across from evidence that he might have been wrong about that. He sat down. He did not order anything. He put his hands flat on the table, which was a gesture she had never seen him make, and it struck her as oddly honest, like someone showing they weren't holding a weapon. "The lien was a mistake," he said. No preamble. "Yes," she said. "I acted without—" He stopped. "I made a decision last night that wasn't fully considered." "You panicked," she said, "and you did it without consulting Elaine, who had built the structure around not panicking." She kept her voice even. "She's not protecting you this morning." His jaw tightened, barely. But she saw it. "I know." "Then why did you want to meet?" He looked at her. For a long moment he just looked at her, and she let him, because she was curious what would emerge when a man like Edmund Harwell ran out of social architecture to hide behind. What she saw was complicated. Not remorse, not quite, but something in the vicinity of it that hadn't finished becoming anything yet. "I want to know what the shape of this is," he said. "What happens now?" "The Monday Council session opens a formal review of the Harbor District proposal," she said. "The Millbridge instruments are being reviewed by a regulatory attorney whose opinion is that 2 of them constitute violations of the Regional Financial Instruments Act. The Financial Monitor is publishing a story in 48 hours based on documentation that covers 3 years of Meridian Holdings operations." She paused. "The 11 families on the Elaine's list are being contacted and referred to legal counsel." She held his gaze. "That's what happens now." The color in his face had shifted slightly. 11, he said. "Yes." "She gave you the full list." "She gave me the full list," Lydia confirmed. "Among other things." He was quiet. She could see him doing the thing he always did, calculating, measuring, looking for the move. But the moves were running out. She could see that too. The social world had a finite number of levers, and she had spent the past 12 hours working most of them. "Marcus Thane filed the defamation suit this morning," he said. "I know," she said. "I got the notification at 8. "It's not going to be dismissed," she said. "Yes, it is." She looked at him. "You need to tell Thane to withdraw it, not because I'm asking you to, but because every day it's active is another day the documentation case is being built in parallel, and when the regulatory findings come out, and they will, Edmund, they will. A defamation suit that was filed against the person who exposed the fraud becomes a separate problem for you in a very specific way." She paused. "Tell Thane to withdraw it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not going to negotiate," he said. Not angrily, almost with something like recognition. "There's nothing to negotiate," she said. "The documentation exists. The process is in motion. What I'm telling you right now is what's coming, not what you can stop." She held his gaze. "The question for you is whether you spend the next 6 months fighting something that's already determined, which will cost you significantly more than it costs me, or whether you get ahead of it." "Get ahead of it," he repeated. "What does that mean?" "It means you stop protecting the structure and start protecting yourself," she said. "Elaine built Meridian. Elaine structured the instruments. You operated the front of it." She paused. "Those are different things. The documentation reflects that, whether how it's presented makes the distinction visible." She let the sentence sit unfinished. His eyes narrowed. "You're offering me what you offered Elaine." "I'm telling you the same thing I told Elaine," she said. "The documentation will be accurate. How it's framed is a choice. The choice is better made before the process locks it in." He sat back. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the ambient noise of the hotel lobby filled the space entirely, all those other people with their own conversations and their ordinary noontime lives moving through a Wednesday in the city. "The families," he said finally. Not a full sentence, just the 2 words. She waited. "I didn't—" He stopped. "Start it again." His voice had lost its professional evenness, just slightly. I knew the instruments were aggressive. I knew some of the families were in genuine distress. He looked up. I told myself it was just business, that everyone plays with aggressive instruments, that the families understood what they were agreeing to. He stopped again. She didn't say anything. She wasn't going to help him through this. He could sit with the weight of it, or he couldn't, but she wasn't going to make it easier. I knew it wasn't just business, he said, quietly. Yes, she said. You did. He nodded, once. The nod of a man accepting something he can't put down. Tell Thane to withdraw, she said again. All right, he said. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at Edmund Harwell one last time. This man who had mapped her family's vulnerability before she'd ever met him, who had held a lien for 18 months and called it patience, who had sat in a corridor and described her future like a balance sheet. And she felt almost nothing toward him that she needed to process. Not forgiveness, not contempt. Something closer to completion. Thank you for meeting me, she said, which was the correct social form, delivered with the correctness that the situation required and nothing else. She walked out of the hotel into the noon light. The next 30 days were not clean. She had never expected them to be, and they weren't. They were complicated and exhausting and full of the specific grinding work of a process that is correct but slow, that requires documentation in triplicate and phone calls that go to voicemail and meetings that produce outcomes that require further meetings. The council session on Monday ran 4 hours and generated more questions than answers, which Voss told her afterward was a sign it was being taken seriously. Easy questions get quick answers. Complicated situations get examined. Derek Kessler's story ran Tuesday morning. It was careful, well-documented, and it named Meridian Holdings specifically and the Millbridge instruments in language that the Financial Monitor's legal team had evidently spent 48 hours stress testing. It did not name Lydia as a source. It named Margaret Alderton, who had spoken on the record, which was the kind of thing that opened doors for others. By Wednesday, 4 other families had contacted Callaway's office. By Friday, Callaway had filed a formal complaint with the Regional Financial Regulatory Authority on behalf of 6 families, with 3 more expected to join. The complaint cited the 2 instruments in the Millbridge restructuring. It cited the Meridian board structure, including Elaine Voss's directorship. It cited the pattern of targeting across 11 families. Edmund's defamation suit was withdrawn Thursday morning. Thane's office cited a procedural reason in the filing. Lydia read the procedural reason and recognized it for what it was: the minimum loss exit from a position that had become untenable. She did not feel triumphant about that specifically. She felt something more like the absence of a pressure she'd stopped noticing because it had become the baseline. A quiet return to a state she hadn't been in for 6 months, where the immediate threat was no longer structural. The lien was released Thursday afternoon, a formal document from Harrow Property Partners signed by Elaine Voss, stating that the instrument was being withdrawn and that the Hale property was free of encumbrance. Her father received it by courier and called her immediately, and she could hear in his voice the specific, almost embarrassing relief of a man who has been trying very hard not to show fear for a long time. It's gone, he said. It's gone, she confirmed. Lydia. His voice was different. I've been thinking about what you said that night. You said we went to the engagement too fast, without enough information. He paused. You're right. I was trying to fix something, and I went looking for a solution before I understood the problem properly. Another pause. You understood the problem. You've understood it longer than I did. Dad, I'm not making a speech, he said. I'm telling you that I know. He stopped. I know what you did, and I know what it cost. She was in her home office when he called, surrounded by the physical evidence of the past month: files, notes, printed documents, the specific archaeology of a legal and social process that was still ongoing. Outside the window, the garden was exactly as it had been, imperfect and overgrown and alive. The hydrangeas along the back wall, she said. I think we should cut them back this winter. They've gotten too big for the planter. A pause. Then her father laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, the laugh she'd known her whole life. I'll get the shears, he said. The formal council vote on the Harbor District proposal came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the Whitmore Gala. The emergency review session had expanded into a full structural analysis, which had taken longer than anyone wanted, and the room where it was voted on was a council chamber, not a ballroom. Wood paneling and institutional lighting and the particular democracy of rows of chairs, no chandelier. Lydia was in the back row. She had been invited to present the revised analysis. She and Adrian had finished it 8 days earlier at his office, across a table covered in documents, and the remains of 2 takeaway coffees, and the particular quiet of 2 people who have been working together long enough to need fewer words. The analysis was better than the original counter-analysis she'd submitted 6 weeks ago. Better because she had more information, and better because she had someone who could challenge her on the section she was weakest on, and she had returned the favor. She had presented it the previous Friday to a council subcommittee of 5. Patricia Sharp had asked 6 questions, all of them good. Voss had asked 2, both of them excellent. The other 3 had asked questions that were adequate. At the end, Sharp had looked at the document and then at Lydia and said, "This should have been the proposal we reviewed 3 months ago." Now the vote was happening. It was 7-2, against the original Meridian-connected proposal, for the revised development framework, which would require a new tender process under a restructured assessment provision that did not allow the assessment firm to have any ownership relationship with the proposing party. Renata Voss read the final vote count with the composed satisfaction of a politician who has done a thing correctly. Then she looked up, and across the room she found Lydia's face in the back row. She gave a nod. Small, specific. Lydia nodded back. Matti. She and Adrian walked out of the council building into late afternoon light. November now. Properly cold. The kind that meant business. The city settling into the gray-blue quality it held for the next 4 months. Their breath came out in small, visible clouds. 7-2, he said. Better than I expected, she admitted. The 2 no votes were always going to be no votes, he said. Marchetti's council contact confirmed that last week. Don't waste time on them. I wasn't planning to. She looked at the street. The city moved past. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon, buses and foot traffic, and someone a block away shouting into a phone with the uninhibited volume of someone who has decided the sidewalk is private. How's the Northern Consortium? Reconvening next month, he said. Without Harwell's interference in the process, the terms are straightforward. We should have a signed agreement by January. And the Harbor District project? Formally? The new tender process opens in December. We'll submit. He glanced at her sideways. We are submitting together, correct? The co-author arrangement I proposed. I said I'd think about it, she said. You've had 3 weeks. I've been busy. Lydia. She kept walking for a moment, then she said, Yes, we're submitting together. She paused. I have conditions. Name them. Equal standing on the proposal, not as a supporting analyst, as a co-author with equal attribution. She looked at him. And I want the Harbor District's residential access component built into the framework from the start, not added as a political concession later. The original proposal treated the residential streets as secondary to the commercial development. That's backwards. He was quiet for a moment. The residential component will complicate the financing structure. The residential component is the reason the development makes sense, she said. Commercial districts without residential integration have a 30-year life cycle, and then they become problems. I can show you the data. I've seen the data, he said. I just wanted to know if you'd push on it. She stopped walking, turned to look at him. Did you just test me? I do that, he said, with the unapologetic simplicity of someone who has no intention of pretending otherwise. You do it too. You've been doing it since the hotel lobby meeting with Edmund. He held her gaze. The residential component stays in, equal attribution. Those are reasonable conditions. She looked at him. At this man who had appeared in a doorway 3 weeks ago with an offered arm and an observation about her counter-analysis, and who had spent those 3 weeks being approximately as useful as anyone she had ever worked with, in the specific, unglamorous, relentless way that useful actually looked. Not as a gesture, not as performance, but as the straightforward application of considerable capability toward a shared objective. You're strange, she said. So I've been told, he said, usually not as a compliment. It's not a compliment, she said. It's an observation. Those aren't different things, he said, which was her own phrase returned, and she knew it was deliberate. She almost laughed. She had been almost laughing around him for 3 weeks and mostly suppressing it, which was, she recognized, a habit she'd built out of social necessity and no longer needed. She let this one through. It came out genuine and slightly undignified, and she didn't fix it. He looked at her with the expression that sometimes crossed his face, the one that had started, she'd noticed, appearing more often. Not quite a smile. The architecture of one. The proposal, she said when she'd recovered. We should start the formal draft this week. Thursday, he said. My office. I'll have the structural engineering report in by then. I'll have the residential data and the access framework. Good. He started walking again. She fell into step beside him. How is your father? Getting better at accepting help, she said. Slowly. He called me last week to ask if I thought he should look at refinancing the estate management costs, and then spent 45 minutes telling me why his original approach had been correct before asking me what I thought. That sounds like progress. It is progress. For him, it's enormous progress. She paused. He likes you, by the way. He said you're the kind of man who says what he means. I try to be. He said it like it was unusual. It is, Adrian said. They walked a block in the comfortable silence of two people who have gotten past the phase where silence needs to be filled. The city moved around them, indifferent and ordinary and alive. Edmund's regulatory hearing has been scheduled for February, she said. Calloway called this morning. I heard. Elaine's proceeding separately. Her lawyer has negotiated a cooperation arrangement with the regulatory body. She's providing documentation in exchange for a reduced penalty framework. She'll cooperate fully, Lydia said. She's too careful to protect him once protecting him costs more than it's worth. Yes. The families? 8 formal civil claims filed. Recovery process is slow, but it's moving. He paused. The Aldertons have their property. The contract void declaration came through last week. She had heard this. She had been glad in a way that felt quiet rather than celebratory. Not the sharp, adrenaline-based satisfaction of the ballroom, but something steadier. Something that had to do with the specific difference between making a decision in a crisis and watching the decision bear actual fruit. Sophie Marchetti called me yesterday, she said. She's applying to law school in the spring. Adrian glanced at her. Because of this? She said she'd been thinking about it for 2 years but couldn't make herself do it. She said, Lydia paused. She said watching someone make a decision that didn't have a guaranteed outcome made her realize she'd been waiting for a version of her own life that had guaranteed outcomes before she started it. A pause. She said she'd wasted 2 years waiting. He was quiet for a moment. That's a strange thing to thank someone for. She didn't thank me, Lydia said. She just told me. I think she wanted someone to know who would understand what she meant. A beat. I understand what she meant, Adrian said. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. She came back to the Whitmore estate once more, 6 weeks after the gala. It wasn't a social event this time. It was a public forum. The estate had been made available for a community meeting organized by 3 of the affected families and chaired by Calloway's office, with the purpose of explaining the regulatory process and what it meant for the civil claims going forward. 40 people in the grand ballroom, chairs set in rows instead of clusters, the chandeliers at full brightness instead of the theatrical dimness of an evening event. She arrived early and stood in the empty room for a moment before the others got there. The marble floor was exactly as she'd left it, white and cold and perfectly polished, throwing back a faint reflection of everything above it. The chandeliers caught the afternoon light differently than they caught candlelight, more honest, less theatrical, the room showing itself as it actually was, rather than as it wanted to appear. She had spent a lot of years studying this room, and rooms like it, learning their acoustic properties and their social geometries, learning where the drafts came from and which side of the serving table had warmer champagne, learning to navigate them without appearing to navigate, to make choices without appearing to choose, to be visible in exactly the ways that were allowed and invisible in the ways that were expected. She looked at the room. The room had not changed. She had. She found a chair in the second row. Not the front, which would have been performative, not the back, which would have been avoidance, and she sat down and waited for the others to arrive. Margaret Alderton came in with her husband. She was 53, and she moved like someone who had put down a weight they'd been carrying for 8 months, which meant she moved slightly lighter than she used to, and slightly more upright. She saw Lydia and came over. "You're here," she said. "I'm here," Lydia said. "Good." Margaret sat down one seat over. Her husband took the aisle seat and opened a folder. He had come prepared, Lydia noticed, with documents and a legal pad, the specific preparation of a man who had decided to stop managing quietly and start managing usefully. "My daughter wants to meet you," Margaret said. "She's 17. She's been following the story in the Financial Monitor." "Tell her she can email me," Lydia said. Margaret looked at her. "She asked what you studied. She's thinking about legal analysis and financial architecture," Lydia said. "With a minor in absolutely refusing to let someone tell you that noticing things is a personality flaw." Margaret laughed. A real one, the kind that surprised her. People were filling in around them. The Marchetti family, Julia and Sophie, and their father, a compact man in his 60s who had the slightly dazed look of someone who had been near a disaster, and then was not. 2 people she recognized from the council session, 5 she didn't. Families who had received Calloway's letter and driven in from surrounding districts because they recognized their own situation in what they'd read. Calloway opened the meeting with a clear, unsentimentalized summary of the regulatory process, what it could and couldn't deliver, what the civil claims timeline looked like, what realistic expectations were. He was a good speaker, direct, careful, not condescending. He answered questions without making the people who asked them feel that they should already have known the answers. Lydia didn't speak during the formal part. She answered 2 questions at the end, both of them practical, about documentation and timeline. She answered them plainly and sat back down. Afterward, in the informal period when people stood and talked and the formality dissolved into the ordinary, a woman found her near the windows. Late 40s, with the particular composure of someone who had been building it deliberately over time. She introduced herself as Anna Reeve. Her family wasn't on Elaine's list. They had pulled out of a Meridian negotiation 12 months ago, before the instruments were signed, because something had felt wrong. "I couldn't say what it was," Anna said. "I just knew something was off." She paused. "We got lucky. If the timing had been different—" "You trusted your own reading of the situation," Lydia said. "That's not luck. That's a decision." Anna looked at her. "You're younger than I expected," she said, "from the Monitor piece." "I get that a lot right now," Lydia said. "It's meant as a compliment." "I know, thank you." Anna looked at the room. "I used to come to the Whitmore events," she said, "the autumn galas. I stopped a few years ago. They started to feel—" she searched for the word, "like a performance I didn't know the lines to." "You knew the lines," Lydia said. "You just stopped finding them worth saying." Anna considered that. Then, "Yes, that's exactly it." She looked at Lydia. "What happens to this room now, after everything that happened here?" Lydia looked at the room. The honest afternoon light and the marble floor and the chandeliers that were just chandeliers now, not theater. "It's still a room," she said. "It's what people do in it that changes." Anna nodded slowly. Then she moved away, back toward her husband, and Lydia stood at the window and watched the forum finish its work around her. Small conversations, exchanges of contact information, the practical infrastructure of people deciding to stay connected, rather than dispersing back into isolation. This was what the room looked like when it was used for something other than performance. She thought it looked better this way. She and Adrian left the Whitmore together, walking out through the main entrance into the cold November afternoon. The city was gray and bright at once, the way it got in late autumn when the sky was overcast, but the light still managed to find the edges of things. "The proposal draft is coming together," he said. "The residential access framework holds up under the financing review. I had Calloway's contact look at the land use provisions. They're clean." "Good." She pulled her coat tighter. "I want to add a community access requirement to the commercial spaces. A minimum percentage of ground floor units at rate-controlled rents for the first 10 years. He looked at her. "You're going to tell me that complicates the financing structure," she said. "It does," he said. "Not unsurvivably. But it does." He was quiet for a moment. "It also makes the proposal harder to challenge on public interest grounds." He paused. "Which may be worth the financing complication." "It is worth it," she said. "It's the right thing. Those are different justifications for the same outcome." "You're going to keep doing this," he said. "Not a complaint. An observation." "Doing what?" "Identifying the right thing and then finding the strategic argument for it afterward," he said. "Which means I'm going to spend a great deal of time reverse engineering the financing structure to accommodate your correct instincts." She looked at him. "You don't seem unhappy about that." He was quiet for a moment. The not-quite smile crossed his face. "No," he said. "I don't seem to be." They walked. The city moved around them. Somewhere behind them, the Whitmore estate stood in its afternoon light, changing into whatever it was going to be next. And ahead of them, the city extended in every direction, full of work that was not finished yet, full of processes that were still in motion, full of problems that required the specific combination of precise analysis and stubbornness, and the willingness to stand in the center of a room and say the true thing out loud. She was 24 years old. She had lost an engagement and an 11-year friendship, and 6 months of believing she knew what her future looked like, all in the space of a single evening. She had walked out of that evening with documentation, 2 allies, a journalist's phone number, and the specific hard-won knowledge that survival was not the same as living, but that it was, sometimes, what you had to do first. She was not finished yet. She was, in fact, barely started. The Harbor District proposal would take 6 months, and it would be contested, and the residential access requirement was going to require 3 additional meetings and probably a revised financing model, and at least one late night when everything seemed impossible. The regulatory hearings would take longer than anyone wanted. The 11 families would recover at different rates, and some of them would be okay, and some of them would carry the damage in ways that didn't fully heal. Clara Fontaine, who had not called and whom Lydia had not called, would remain somewhere in the city in the complicated aftermath of choices made for complicated reasons. Elaine Voss would cooperate with the regulatory body and receive a reduced penalty and continue to be a woman who was very good at calculating her own interests. Edmund Harwell would face a February hearing and would emerge from it diminished in ways that were real and permanent, and he would spend the rest of his career operating in the smaller space that the February hearing defined, and that was both just and insufficient, as most outcomes were, and it was what there was. None of this was clean. None of it was finished. All of it was hers. She walked into the November city with her coat pulled tight and the proposal draft on her phone and the names of 40 people who had sat in rows in the Whitmore Ballroom this afternoon and decided not to be isolated anymore. And she was tired in a way that had stopped feeling like defeat and started feeling like evidence. Evidence of the specific, irreplaceable weight of work that matters. Work that costs you something. Work that leaves a mark on the world that remains after you've rested and gotten up and gone back to it. She had stood in the center of a room once and been given a pale blue dress that didn't compete. She was done with that.